Chapter 19 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 19. Zenobia's Drawing Room. The remainder of the day, so far as I was concerned, was spent in meditating on these recent incidents. I contrived, and alternately rejected, innumerable methods of accounting for the presence of Zenobia and Priscilla, and the connection of Westervelt with both. It must be owned, too, that I had a keen, revengeful sense of the insult inflicted by Zenobia's scornful recognition, and more particularly by her letting down the curtain, as if such were the proper barrier to be interposed between a character like hers and a perceptive faculty like mine. For was mine a mere vulgar curiosity? Zenobia should have known me better than to suppose it. She should have been able to appreciate that quality of the intellect and the heart which impelled me, often against my own will and to the detriment of my own comfort, to live in other lives, and to endeavor, by generous sympathies, by delicate intuitions, by taking note of things too slight for record, and by bringing my human spirit into manifold accordance with the companions whom God assigned me, to learn the secret which was hidden even from themselves. Of all possible observers, methought a woman like Zenobia and a man like Hollingsworth should have selected me. And now, when the event has long been past, I retain the same opinion of my fitness for the office. True, I might have condemned them. Had I been judge as well as witness, my sentence might have been stern as that of destiny itself. But still, no trait of original nobility of character, no struggle against temptation, no iron necessity of will on the one hand, nor extenuating circumstance to be derived from passion and despair on the other, no remorse that might coexist with error, even if powerless to prevent it, no proud repentance that should claim retribution as a meed, would go unappreciated. True, again, I might give my full assent to the punishment which was sure to follow; but it would be given mournfully and with undiminished love; and after all was finished, I would come as if to gather up the white ashes of those who had perished at the stake, and to tell the world, the wrong being now atoned for, how much had perished there, which it had never yet known how to praise. I sat in my rocking chair, too far withdrawn from the window to expose myself to another rebuke like that already inflicted. My eyes still wandered towards the opposite house, but without effecting any new discoveries. Late in the afternoon, the weathercock on the church spire indicated a change of wind. The sun shone dimly out, as if the golden wine of its beams were mingled half and half with water. Nevertheless, they kindled up the whole range of edifices, threw a glow over the windows, glistened on the wet roofs, and, slowly withdrawing upward, perched upon the chimney tops. Thence they took a higher flight, and lingered an instant on the tip of the spire, making it the final point of more cheerful light in the whole sombre scene. The next moment it was all gone. The twilight fell into the area like a shower of dusky snow, and before it was quite dark, the gong of the hotel summoned me to tea. When I returned to my chamber, the glow of an astral lamp was penetrating mistily through the white curtain of Zenobia's drawing room. The shadow of a passing figure was now and then cast upon this medium, but with too vague an outline for even my adventurous conjectures to read the hieroglyphic that it presented. All at once it occurred to me how very absurd was my behavior in thus tormenting myself with crazy hypotheses as to what was going on within that drawing room, when it was at my option to be personally present there. My relations with Zenobia, as yet unchanged, as a familiar friend, and associated in the same lifelong enterprise, gave me the right, and made it no more than kindly courtesy demanded, to call on her. Nothing, except our habitual independence of conventional rules at Blithedale, could have kept me from sooner recognizing this duty. At all events, it should now be performed. In compliance with this sudden impulse, I soon found myself actually within the house, the rear of which, for 2 days past, I had been so sedulously watching. A servant took my card, and, immediately returning, ushered me upstairs. On the way, I heard a rich and, as it were, triumphant burst of music from a piano, in which I felt Zenobia's character, although heretofore I had known nothing of her skill upon the instrument. 2 or 3 canary birds, excited by this gush of sound, sang piercingly, and did their utmost to produce a kindred melody. A bright illumination streamed through the door of the front drawing room, and I had barely stepped across the threshold before Zenobia came forward to meet me, laughing, and with an extended hand. "Ah, Mr. Coverdale," said she, still smiling, but, as I thought, with a good deal of scornful anger underneath. "It has gratified me to see the interest which you continue to take in my affairs. I have long recognized you as a sort of transcendental Yankee, with all the native propensity of your countrymen to investigate matters that come within their range, but rendered almost poetical, in your case, by the refined methods which you adopt for its gratification. After all, it was an unjustifiable stroke on my part, was it not, to let down the window curtain?" "I cannot call it a very wise one," returned I, with a secret bitterness, which no doubt Zenobia appreciated. "It is really impossible to hide anything in this world, to say nothing of the next. All that we ought to ask, therefore, is that the witnesses of our conduct, and the speculators on our motives, should be capable of taking the highest view which the circumstances of the case may admit. So much being secured, I, for one, would be most happy in feeling myself followed everywhere by an indefatigable human sympathy." "We must trust for intelligent sympathy to our guardian angels, if any there be," said Zenobia. "As long as the only spectator of my poor tragedy is a young man at the window of his hotel, I must still claim the liberty to drop the curtain." While this passed, as Zenobia's hand was extended, I had applied the very slightest touch of my fingers to her own. In spite of an external freedom, her manner made me sensible that we stood upon no real terms of confidence. The thought came sadly across me, how great was the contrast betwixt this interview and our first meeting. Then, in the warm light of the country fireside, Zenobia had greeted me cheerily and hopefully, with a full sisterly grasp of the hand, conveying as much kindness in it as other women could have evinced by the pressure of both arms around my neck, or by yielding a cheek to the brotherly salute. The difference was as complete as between her appearance at that time, so simply attired, and with only the one superb flower in her hair, and now, when her beauty was set off by all that dress and ornament could do for it. And they did much. Not, indeed, that they created or added anything to what nature had lavishly done for Zenobia, but those costly robes which she had on, those flaming jewels on her neck, served as lamps to display the personal advantages which required nothing less than such an illumination to be fully seen. Even her characteristic flower, though it seemed to be still there, had undergone a cold and bright transfiguration. It was a flower exquisitely imitated in jeweller's work, and imparting the last touch that transformed Zenobia into a work of art. "I scarcely feel," I could not forbear saying, "as if we had ever met before. How many years ago it seems since we last sat beneath Eliot's pulpit, with Hollingsworth extended on the fallen leaves, and Priscilla at his feet! Can it be, Zenobia, that you ever really numbered yourself with our little band of earnest, thoughtful, philanthropic laborers?" "Those ideas have their time and place," she answered coldly; "but I fancy it must be a very circumscribed mind that can find room for no other." Her manner bewildered me. Literally, moreover, I was dazzled by the brilliancy of the room. A chandelier hung down in the centre, glowing with I know not how many lights. There were separate lamps also, on 2 or 3 tables, and on marble brackets, adding their white radiance to that of the chandelier. The furniture was exceedingly rich. Fresh from our old farmhouse, with its homely board and benches in the dining room, and a few wicker chairs in the best parlor, it struck me that here was the fulfillment of every fantasy of an imagination revelling in various methods of costly self indulgence and splendid ease. Pictures, marbles, vases, in brief, more shapes of luxury than there could be any object in enumerating, except for an auctioneer's advertisement, and the whole repeated and doubled by the reflection of a great mirror, which showed me Zenobia's proud figure likewise, and my own. It cost me, I acknowledge, a bitter sense of shame, to perceive in myself a positive effort to bear up against the effect which Zenobia sought to impose on me. I reasoned against her in my secret mind, and strove so to keep my footing. In the gorgeousness with which she had surrounded herself, in the redundance of personal ornament, which the largeness of her physical nature and the rich type of her beauty caused to seem so suitable, I malevolently beheld the true character of the woman, passionate, luxurious, lacking simplicity, not deeply refined, incapable of pure and perfect taste. But the next instant she was too powerful for all my opposing struggles. I saw how fit it was that she should make herself as gorgeous as she pleased, and should do 1,000 things that would have been ridiculous in the poor, thin, weakly characters of other women. To this day, however, I hardly know whether I then beheld Zenobia in her truest attitude, or whether that were the truer one in which she had presented herself at Blithedale. In both, there was something like the illusion which a great actress flings around her. "Have you given up Blithedale forever?" I inquired. "Why should you think so?" asked she. "I cannot tell," answered I, "except that it appears all like a dream that we were ever there together." "It is not so to me," said Zenobia. "I should think it a poor and meagre nature that is capable of but one set of forms, and must convert all the past into a dream, merely because the present happens to be unlike it. Why should we be content with our homely life of a few months past, to the exclusion of all other modes? It was good, but there are other lives as good, or better. Not, you will understand, that I condemn those who give themselves up to it more entirely than I, for myself, should deem it wise to do." It irritated me, this self complacent, condescending, qualified approval and criticism of a system to which many individuals, perhaps as highly endowed as our gorgeous Zenobia, had contributed their all of earthly endeavor and their loftiest aspirations. I determined to make proof if there were any spell that would exorcise her out of the part which she seemed to be acting. She should be compelled to give me a glimpse of something true, some nature, some passion, no matter whether right or wrong, provided it were real. "Your allusion to that class of circumscribed characters who can live only in one mode of life," remarked I coolly, "reminds me of our poor friend Hollingsworth. Perhaps he was in your thoughts when you spoke thus. Poor fellow! It is a pity that, by the fault of a narrow education, he should have so completely immolated himself to that one idea of his, especially as the slightest modicum of common sense would teach him its utter impracticability. Now that I have returned into the world, and can look at his project from a distance, it requires quite all my real regard for this respectable and well intentioned man to prevent me from laughing at him, as I find society at large does." Zenobia's eyes darted lightning, her cheeks flushed, the vividness of her expression was like the effect of a powerful light flaming up suddenly within her. My experiment had fully succeeded. She had shown me the true flesh and blood of her heart, by thus involuntarily resenting my slight, pitying, half kind, half scornful mention of the man who was all in all with her. She herself probably felt this, for it was hardly a moment before she tranquillized her uneven breath, and seemed as proud and self possessed as ever. "I rather imagine," said she quietly, "that your appreciation falls short of Mr. Hollingsworth's just claims. blind enthusiasm, absorption in one idea, I grant, is generally ridiculous, and must be fatal to the respectability of an ordinary man. It requires a very high and powerful character to make it otherwise. But a great man, as perhaps you do not know, attains his normal condition only through the inspiration of one great idea. As a friend of Mr. Hollingsworth, and at the same time a calm observer, I must tell you that he seems to me such a man. But you are very pardonable for fancying him ridiculous. Doubtless he is so, to you. There can be no truer test of the noble and heroic in any individual than the degree in which he possesses the faculty of distinguishing heroism from absurdity. I dared make no retort to Zenobia's concluding apothegm. In truth, I admired her fidelity. It gave me a new sense of Hollingsworth's native power to discover that his influence was no less potent with this beautiful woman here, in the midst of artificial life, than it had been at the foot of the gray rock, and among the wild birch trees of the wood path, when she so passionately pressed his hand against her heart. The great, rude, shaggy, swarthy man, and Zenobia loved him. "Did you bring Priscilla with you?" I resumed. "Do you know, I have sometimes fancied it not quite safe, considering the susceptibility of her temperament, that she should be so constantly within the sphere of a man like Hollingsworth. Such tender and delicate natures among your sex have often, I believe, a very adequate appreciation of the heroic element in men. But then, again, I should suppose them as likely as any other women to make a reciprocal impression. Hollingsworth could hardly give his affections to a person capable of taking an independent stand, but only to one whom he might absorb into himself. He has certainly shown great tenderness for Priscilla." Zenobia had turned aside, but I caught the reflection of her face in the mirror, and saw that it was very pale, as pale, in her rich attire, as if a shroud were round her. "Priscilla is here," said she, her voice a little lower than usual. "Have you not learnt as much from your chamber window? Would you like to see her?" She made a step or two into the back drawing room, and called, "Priscilla! Dear Priscilla!" Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 20. They Vanish. Priscilla immediately answered the summons, and made her appearance through the door of the boudoir. I had conceived the idea, which I now recognized as a very foolish one, that Zenobia would have taken measures to debar me from an interview with this girl, between whom and herself there was so utter an opposition of their dearest interests, that on one part or the other a great grief, if not likewise a great wrong, seemed a matter of necessity. But as Priscilla was only a leaf floating on the dark current of events, without influencing them by her own choice or plan, as she probably guessed not whither the stream was bearing her, nor perhaps even felt its inevitable movement, there could be no peril of her communicating to me any intelligence with regard to Zenobia's purposes. On perceiving me, she came forward with great quietude of manner, and when I held out my hand, her own moved slightly towards it, as if attracted by a feeble degree of magnetism. "I am glad to see you, my dear Priscilla," said I, still holding her hand. "But everything that I meet with nowadays makes me wonder whether I am awake. You, especially, have always seemed like a figure in a dream, and now more than ever." "Oh, there is substance in these fingers of mine," she answered, giving my hand the faintest possible pressure, and then taking away her own. "Why do you call me a dream? Zenobia is much more like one than I. She is so very, very beautiful. And I suppose," added Priscilla, as if thinking aloud, "everybody sees it, as I do." But for my part it was Priscilla's beauty, not Zenobia's, of which I was thinking at that moment. She was a person who could be quite obliterated, as far as beauty went, by anything unsuitable in her attire. Her charm was not positive and material enough to bear up against a mistaken choice of color, for instance, or fashion. It was safest in her case to attempt no art of dress, for it demanded the most perfect taste, or else the happiest accident in the world, to give her precisely the adornment which she needed. She was now dressed in pure white, set off with some kind of a gauzy fabric, which, as I bring up her figure in my memory, with a faint gleam on her shadowy hair, and her dark eyes bent shyly on mine through all the vanished years, seems to be floating about her like a mist. I wondered what Zenobia meant by evolving so much loveliness out of this poor girl. It was what few women could afford to do, for as I looked from one to the other, the sheen and splendor of Zenobia's presence took nothing from Priscilla's softer spell, if it might not rather be thought to add to it. "What do you think of her?" asked Zenobia. I could not understand the look of melancholy kindness with which Zenobia regarded her. She advanced a step, and, beckoning Priscilla near her, kissed her cheek. Then, with a slight gesture of repulse, she moved to the other side of the room. I followed. "She is a wonderful creature," I said. "Ever since she came among us, I have been dimly sensible of just this charm which you have brought out. But it was never absolutely visible till now. She is as lovely as a flower." "Well, say so if you like," answered Zenobia. "You are a poet, at least as poets go nowadays, and must be allowed to make an opera glass of your imagination when you look at women. I wonder, in such Arcadian freedom of falling in love as we have lately enjoyed, it never occurred to you to fall in love with Priscilla. In society, indeed, a genuine American never dreams of stepping across the inappreciable air line which separates one class from another, but what was rank to the colonists of Blithedale?" "There were other reasons," I replied, "why I should have demonstrated myself an ass, had I fallen in love with Priscilla. By the by, has Hollingsworth ever seen her in this dress?" "Why do you bring up his name at every turn?" asked Zenobia in an undertone, and with a malign look which wandered from my face to Priscilla's. "You know not what you do. It is dangerous, sir, believe me, to tamper thus with earnest human passions, out of your own mere idleness, and for your sport. I will endure it no longer. Take care that it does not happen again, I warn you." "You partly wrong me, if not wholly," I responded. "It is an uncertain sense of some duty to perform that brings my thoughts, and therefore my words, continually to that one point." "Oh, this stale excuse of duty!" said Zenobia, in a whisper so full of scorn that it penetrated me like the hiss of a serpent. "I have often heard it before, from those who sought to interfere with me, and I know precisely what it signifies. Bigotry, self conceit, an insolent curiosity, a meddlesome temper, a cold blooded criticism, founded on a shallow interpretation of half perceptions, a monstrous skepticism in regard to any conscience or any wisdom except one's own, a most irreverent propensity to thrust Providence aside, and substitute one's self in its awful place. Out of these, and other motives as miserable as these, comes your idea of duty. But beware, sir! With all your fancied acuteness, you step blindfold into these affairs. For any mischief that may follow your interference, I hold you responsible." It was evident that, with but a little further provocation, the lioness would turn to bay, if indeed such were not her attitude already. I bowed, and, not very well knowing what else to do, was about to withdraw. But glancing again towards Priscilla, who had retreated into a corner, there fell upon my heart an intolerable burden of despondency, the purport of which I could not tell, but only felt it to bear reference to her. I approached and held out my hand, a gesture, however, to which she made no response. It was always one of her peculiarities that she seemed to shrink from even the most friendly touch, unless it were Zenobia's or Hollingsworth's. Zenobia, all this while, stood watching us, but with a careless expression, as if it mattered very little what might pass. "Priscilla," I inquired, lowering my voice, "when do you go back to Blithedale?" "Whenever they please to take me," said she. "Did you come away of your own free will?" I asked. "I am blown about like a leaf," she replied. "I never have any free will." "Does Hollingsworth know that you are here?" said I. "He bade me come," answered Priscilla. She looked at me, I thought, with an air of surprise, as if the idea were incomprehensible that she should have taken this step without his agency. "What a gripe this man has laid upon her whole being!" muttered I between my teeth. "Well, as Zenobia so kindly intimates, I have no more business here. I wash my hands of it all. On Hollingsworth's head be the consequences. Priscilla," I added aloud, "I know not that ever we may meet again. Farewell!" As I spoke the word, a carriage had rumbled along the street, and stopped before the house. The door bell rang, and steps were immediately afterwards heard on the staircase. Zenobia had thrown a shawl over her dress. "Mr. Coverdale," said she, with cool courtesy, "you will perhaps excuse us. We have an engagement, and are going out." "Whither?" I demanded. "Is not that a little more than you are entitled to inquire?" said she, with a smile. "At all events, it does not suit me to tell you." The door of the drawing room opened, and Westervelt appeared. I observed that he was elaborately dressed, as if for some grand entertainment. My dislike for this man was infinite. At that moment it amounted to nothing less than a creeping of the flesh, as when, feeling about in a dark place, one touches something cold and slimy, and questions what the secret hatefulness may be. And still I could not but acknowledge that for personal beauty, for polish of manner, for all that externally befits a gentleman, there was hardly another like him. After bowing to Zenobia, and graciously saluting Priscilla in her corner, he recognized me by a slight but courteous inclination. "Come, Priscilla," said Zenobia. "It is time. Mr. Coverdale, good evening." As Priscilla moved slowly forward, I met her in the middle of the drawing room. "Priscilla," said I, in the hearing of them all, "do you know whither you are going?" "I do not know," she answered. "Is it wise to go, and is it your choice to go?" I asked. "If not, I am your friend, and Hollingsworth's friend. Tell me so at once." "Possibly," observed Westervelt, smiling, "Priscilla sees in me an older friend than either Mr. Coverdale or Mr. Hollingsworth. I shall willingly leave the matter at her option." While thus speaking, he made a gesture of kindly invitation, and Priscilla passed me with the gliding movement of a sprite, and took his offered arm. He offered the other to Zenobia, but she turned her proud and beautiful face upon him with a look which, judging from what I caught of it in profile, would undoubtedly have smitten the man dead, had he possessed any heart, or had this glance attained to it. It seemed to rebound, however, from his courteous visage, like an arrow from polished steel. They all three descended the stairs, and when I likewise reached the street door, the carriage was already rolling away. Chapter 21 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 21. An Old Acquaintance. Thus excluded from everybody's confidence, and attaining no further by my most earnest study than to an uncertain sense of something hidden from me, it would appear reasonable that I should have flung off all these alien perplexities. Obviously, my best course was to betake myself to new scenes. Here I was only an intruder. Elsewhere there might be circumstances in which I could establish a personal interest, and people who would respond, with a portion of their sympathies, for so much as I should bestow of mine. Nevertheless, there occurred to me one other thing to be done. Remembering old Moody and his relationship with Priscilla, I determined to seek an interview, for the purpose of ascertaining whether the knot of affairs was as inextricable on that side as I found it on all others. Being tolerably well acquainted with the old man's haunts, I went, the next day, to the saloon of a certain establishment about which he often lurked. It was a reputable place enough, affording good entertainment in the way of meat, drink, and fumigation, and there, in my young and idle days and nights, when I was neither nice nor wise, I had often amused myself with watching the staid humors and sober jollities of the thirsty souls around me. At my first entrance, old Moody was not there. The more patiently to await him, I lighted a cigar, and, establishing myself in a corner, took a quiet, and, by sympathy, a boozy kind of pleasure in the customary life that was going forward. The saloon was fitted up with a good deal of taste. There were pictures on the walls, and among them an oil painting of a beefsteak, with such an admirable show of juicy tenderness that the beholder sighed to think it merely visionary, and incapable of ever being put upon a gridiron. Another work of high art was the lifelike representation of a noble sirloin; another, the hindquarters of a deer, retaining the hoofs and tawny fur; another, the head and shoulders of a salmon; and, still more exquisitely finished, a brace of canvas-back ducks, in which the mottled feathers were depicted with the accuracy of a daguerreotype. Some very hungry painter, I suppose, had wrought these subjects of still life, heightening his imagination with his appetite, and earning, it is to be hoped, the privilege of a daily dinner off whichever of his pictorial viands he liked best. Then there was a fine old cheese, in which you could almost discern the mites; and some sardines, on a small plate, very richly done, and looking as if oozy with the oil in which they had been smothered. All these things were so perfectly imitated that you seemed to have the genuine article before you, and yet with an indescribable, ideal charm. It took away the grossness from what was fleshiest and fattest, and thus helped the life of man, even in its earthliest relations, to appear rich and noble, as well as warm, cheerful, and substantial. There were pictures, too, of gallant revellers, those of the old time, Flemish apparently, with doublets and slashed sleeves, drinking their wine out of fantastic, long stemmed glasses, quaffing joyously, quaffing forever, with inaudible laughter and song, while the champagne bubbled immortally against their mustaches, or the purple tide of Burgundy ran inexhaustibly down their throats. But in an obscure corner of the saloon there was a little picture, excellently done, moreover, of a ragged, bloated New England toper, stretched out on a bench in the heavy apoplectic sleep of drunkenness. The death in life was too well portrayed. You smelt the fumy liquor that had brought on this syncope. Your only comfort lay in the forced reflection that, real as he looked, the poor caitiff was but imaginary, a bit of painted canvas whom no delirium tremens, nor so much as a retributive headache, awaited on the morrow. By this time, it being past 11 o'clock, the two barkeepers of the saloon were in pretty constant activity. One of these young men had a rare faculty in the concoction of gin cocktails. It was a spectacle to behold how, with a tumbler in each hand, he tossed the contents from one to the other. Never conveying it awry, nor spilling the least drop, he compelled the frothy liquor, as it seemed to me, to spout forth from one glass, and descend into the other, in a great parabolic curve, as well defined and calculable as a planet's orbit. He had a good forehead, with a particularly large development just above the eyebrows, fine intellectual gifts, no doubt, which he had educated to this profitable end, being famous for nothing but gin cocktails, and commanding a fair salary by his one accomplishment. These cocktails and other artificial combinations of liquor, of which there were at least a score, though mostly, I suspect, fantastic in their differences, were much in favor with the younger class of customers, who at farthest had only reached the second stage of potatory life. The staunch old soakers, on the other hand, men who, if put on tap, would have yielded a red alcoholic liquor by way of blood, usually confined themselves to plain brandy and water, gin, or West India rum, and oftentimes they prefaced their dram with some medicinal remark as to the wholesomeness and stomachic qualities of that particular drink. Two or three appeared to have bottles of their own behind the counter, and, winking one red eye to the barkeeper, he forthwith produced these choicest and peculiar cordials, which it was a matter of great interest and favor among their acquaintances to obtain a sip of. Agreeably to the Yankee habit, under whatever circumstances, the deportment of all these good fellows, old or young, was decorous and thoroughly correct. They grew only the more sober in their cups. There was no confused babble nor boisterous laughter. They sucked in the joyous fire of the decanters, and kept it smouldering in their inmost recesses with a bliss known only to the heart which it warmed and comforted. Their eyes twinkled a little, to be sure. They hemmed vigorously after each glass, and laid a hand upon the pit of the stomach, as if the pleasant titillation there was what constituted the tangible part of their enjoyment. In that spot, unquestionably, and not in the brain, was the acme of the whole affair. But the true purpose of their drinking, and one that will induce men to drink or do something equivalent as long as this weary world shall endure, was the renewed youth and vigor, the brisk, cheerful sense of things present and to come, with which, for about a quarter of an hour, the dram permeated their systems. And when such quarters of an hour can be obtained in some mode less baneful to the great sum of a man's life, but nevertheless with a little spice of impropriety to give it a wild flavor, we temperance people may ring out our bells for victory. The prettiest object in the saloon was a tiny fountain, which threw up its feathery jet through the counter, and sparkled down again into an oval basin, or lakelet, containing several goldfishes. There was a bed of bright sand at the bottom, strewn with coral and rock work, and the fishes went gleaming about, now turning up the sheen of a golden side, and now vanishing into the shadows of the water, like the fanciful thoughts that coquette with a poet in his dream. Never before, I imagine, did a company of water drinkers remain so entirely uncontaminated by the bad example around them. Nor could I help wondering that it had not occurred to any freakish inebriate to empty a glass of liquor into their lakelet. What a delightful idea! Who would not be a fish if he could inhale jollity with the essential element of his existence? I had begun to despair of meeting old Moodie, when all at once I recognized his hand and arm protruding from behind a screen that was set up for the accommodation of bashful topers. As a matter of course, he had one of Priscilla's little purses, and was quietly insinuating it under the notice of a person who stood near. This was always old Moodie's way. You hardly ever saw him advancing towards you, but became aware of his proximity without being able to guess how he had come thither. He glided about like a spirit, assuming visibility close to your elbow, offering his petty trifles of merchandise, remaining long enough for you to purchase, if so disposed, and then taking himself off between two breaths, while you happened to be thinking of something else. By a sort of sympathetic impulse that often controlled me in those more irrepressible days of my life, I was induced to approach this old man in a mode as undemonstrative as his own. Thus, when, according to his custom, he was probably just about to vanish, he found me at his elbow. "Ah!" said he, with more emphasis than was usual with him, "it is Mr. Coverdale." "Yes, Mr. Moodie, your old acquaintance," answered I. "It is some time now since we ate luncheon together at Blithedale, and a good deal longer since our little talk together at the street corner." "That was a good while ago," said the old man; and he seemed inclined to say not a word more. His existence looked so colorless and torpid, so very faintly shadowed on the canvas of reality, that I was half afraid lest he should altogether disappear, even while my eyes were fixed full upon his figure. He was certainly the wretchedest old ghost in the world, with his crazy hat, the dingy handkerchief about his throat, his suit of threadbare gray, and especially that patch over his right eye, behind which he always seemed to be hiding himself. There was one method, however, of bringing him out into somewhat stronger relief. A glass of brandy would effect it. Perhaps the gentler influence of a bottle of claret might do the same. Nor could I think it a matter for the recording angel to write down against me, if, with my painful consciousness of the frost in this old man's blood, and the positive ice that had congealed about his heart, I should thaw him out, were it only for an hour, with the summer warmth of a little wine. What else could possibly be done for him? How else could he be imbued with energy enough to hope for a happier state hereafter? How else be inspired to say his prayers? For there are states of our spiritual system when the throb of the soul's life is too faint and weak to render us capable of religious aspiration. "Mr. Moodie," said I, "shall we lunch together? And would you like to drink a glass of wine?" His one eye gleamed. He bowed; and it impressed me that he grew to be more of a man at once, either in anticipation of the wine, or as a grateful response to my good fellowship in offering it. "With pleasure," he replied. The barkeeper, at my request, showed us into a private room, and soon afterwards set some fried oysters and a bottle of claret on the table; and I saw the old man glance curiously at the label of the bottle, as if to learn the brand. "It should be good wine," I remarked, "if it have any right to its label." "You cannot suppose, sir," said Moodie, with a sigh, "that a poor old fellow like me knows any difference in wines." And yet, in his way of handling the glass, in his preliminary snuff at the aroma, in his first cautious sip of the wine, and the gustatory skill with which he gave his palate the full advantage of it, it was impossible not to recognize the connoisseur. "I fancy, Mr. Moodie," said I, "you are a much better judge of wines than I have yet learned to be. Tell me fairly, did you never drink it where the grape grows?" "How should that have been, Mr. Coverdale?" answered old Moodie shyly. But then he took courage, as it were, and uttered a feeble little laugh. "The flavor of this wine," added he, "and its perfume still more than its taste, makes me remember that I was once a young man." "I wish, Mr. Moodie," suggested I, not that I greatly cared about it, however, but was only anxious to draw him into some talk about Priscilla and Zenobia, "I wish, while we sit over our wine, you would favor me with a few of those youthful reminiscences." "Ah," said he, shaking his head, "they might interest you more than you suppose. But I had better be silent, Mr. Coverdale. If this good wine though claret, I suppose, is not apt to play such a trick but if it should make my tongue run too freely, I could never look you in the face again." "You never did look me in the face, Mr. Moodie," I replied, "until this very moment." "Ah!" sighed old Moodie. It was wonderful, however, what an effect the mild grape juice wrought upon him. It was not in the wine, but in the associations which it seemed to bring up. Instead of the mean, slouching, furtive, painfully depressed air of an old city vagabond, more like a gray kennel rat than any other living thing, he began to take the aspect of a decayed gentleman. Even his garments, especially after I had myself quaffed a glass or two, looked less shabby than when we first sat down. There was, by and by, a certain exuberance and elaborateness of gesture and manner, oddly in contrast with all that I had hitherto seen of him. Anon, with hardly any impulse from me, old Moodie began to talk. His communications referred exclusively to a long past and more fortunate period of his life, with only a few unavoidable allusions to the circumstances that had reduced him to his present state. But having once got the clew, my subsequent researches acquainted me with the main facts of the following narrative, although in writing it out my pen has perhaps allowed itself a trifle of romantic and legendary license, worthier of a small poet than of a grave biographer. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 22. Fauntleroy. 25 years ago, at the epoch of this story, there dwelt in one of the Middle States a man whom we shall call Fauntleroy, a man of wealth and magnificent tastes and prodigal expenditure. His home might almost be styled a palace; his habits, in the ordinary sense, princely. His whole being seemed to have crystallized itself into an external splendor, wherewith he glittered in the eyes of the world, and had no other life than upon this gaudy surface. He had married a lovely woman, whose nature was deeper than his own; but his affection for her, though it showed largely, was superficial, like all his other manifestations and developments. He did not so truly keep this noble creature in his heart, as wear her beauty for the most brilliant ornament of his outward state. And there was born to him a child, a beautiful daughter, whom he took from the beneficent hand of God, with no just sense of her immortal value, but as a man already rich in gems would receive another jewel. If he loved her, it was because she shone. After Fauntleroy had thus spent a few empty years, coruscating continually an unnatural light, the source of it, which was merely his gold, began to grow more shallow, and finally became exhausted. He saw himself in imminent peril of losing all that had heretofore distinguished him; and, conscious of no innate worth to fall back upon, he recoiled from this calamity with the instinct of a soul shrinking from annihilation. To avoid it, wretched man, or rather to defer it, if but for a month, a day, or only to procure himself the life of a few breaths more amid the false glitter which was now less his own than ever, he made himself guilty of a crime. It was just the sort of crime, growing out of its artificial state, which society, unless it should change its entire constitution for this man's unworthy sake, neither could nor ought to pardon. More safely might it pardon murder. Fauntleroy's guilt was discovered. He fled. His wife perished, by the necessity of her innate nobleness, in its alliance with a being so ignoble; and betwixt her mother's death and her father's ignominy, his daughter was left worse than orphaned. There was no pursuit after Fauntleroy. His family connections, who had great wealth, made such arrangements with those whom he had attempted to wrong as secured him from the retribution that would have overtaken an unfriended criminal. The wreck of his estate was divided among his creditors. His name, in a very brief space, was forgotten by the multitude who had passed it so diligently from mouth to mouth. Seldom, indeed, was it recalled, even by his closest former intimates. Nor could it have been otherwise. The man had laid no real touch on any mortal's heart. Being a mere image, an optical delusion created by the sunshine of prosperity, it was his law to vanish into the shadow of the first intervening cloud. He seemed to leave no vacancy, a phenomenon which, like many others that attended his brief career, went far to prove the elusiveness of his existence. Not, however, that the physical substance of Fauntleroy had literally melted into vapor. He had fled northward to the New England metropolis, and had taken up his abode under another name in a squalid street or court of the older portion of the city. There he dwelt among poverty stricken wretches, sinners, and forlorn good people, Irish, and whomsoever else were neediest. Many families were clustered in each house together, above stairs and below, in the little peaked garrets, and even in the dusky cellars. The house where Fauntleroy paid weekly rent for a chamber and a closet had been a stately habitation in its day. An old colonial governor had built it, and lived there long ago, and held his levees in a great room where now slept 20 Irish bedfellows, and died in Fauntleroy's chamber, which his embroidered and white-wigged ghost still haunted. Tattered hangings, a marble hearth traversed with many cracks and fissures, a richly carved oaken mantelpiece partly hacked away for kindling stuff, a stuccoed ceiling defaced with great unsightly patches of the naked laths, such was the chamber's aspect, as if with its splinters and rags of dirty splendor it were a kind of practical gibe at this poor ruined man of show. At first, and at irregular intervals, his relatives allowed Fauntleroy a little pittance to sustain life; not from any love, perhaps, but lest poverty should compel him, by new offenses, to add more shame to that with which he had already stained them. But he showed no tendency to further guilt. His character appeared to have been radically changed, as indeed from its shallowness it well might, by his miserable fate. Or, it may be, the traits now seen in him were portions of the same character, presenting itself in another phase. Instead of any longer seeking to live in the sight of the world, his impulse was to shrink into the nearest obscurity, and to be unseen of men, were it possible, even while standing before their eyes. He had no pride; it was all trodden in the dust. No ostentation, for how could it survive when there was nothing left of Fauntleroy save penury and shame? His very gait demonstrated that he would gladly have faded out of view, and have crept about invisibly, for the sake of sheltering himself from the irksomeness of a human glance. Hardly, it was averred, within the memory of those who knew him now, had he the hardihood to show his full front to the world. He skulked in corners, and crept about in a sort of noonday twilight, making himself gray and misty at all hours, with his morbid intolerance of sunshine. In his torpid despair, however, he had done an act which that condition of the spirit seems to prompt almost as often as prosperity and hope. Fauntleroy was again married. He had taken to wife a forlorn, meek-spirited, feeble young woman, a seamstress, whom he found dwelling with her mother in a contiguous chamber of the old gubernatorial residence. This poor phantom, as the beautiful and noble companion of his former life had done, brought him a daughter. And sometimes, as from one dream into another, Fauntleroy looked forth out of his present grimy environment into that past magnificence, and wondered whether the grandee of yesterday or the pauper of to day were real. But in my mind the one and the other were alike impalpable. In truth, it was Fauntleroy's fatality to behold whatever he touched dissolve. After a few years, his second wife, dim shadow that she had always been, faded finally out of the world, and left Fauntleroy to deal as he might with their pale and nervous child. And by this time, among his distant relatives, with whom he had grown a weary thought, linked with contagious infamy, and which they were only too willing to get rid of, he was himself supposed to be no more. The younger child, like his elder one, might be considered as the true offspring of both parents, and as the reflection of their state. She was a tremulous little creature, shrinking involuntarily from all mankind, but in timidity and no sour repugnance. There was a lack of human substance in her. It seemed as if, were she to stand up in a sunbeam, it would pass right through her figure, and trace out the cracked and dusty window panes upon the naked floor. But nevertheless the poor child had a heart, and from her mother's gentle character she had inherited a profound and still capacity of affection. And so her life was one of love. She bestowed it partly on her father, but in greater part on an idea. For Fauntleroy, as they sat by their cheerless fireside, which was no fireside in truth, but only a rusty stove, had often talked to the little girl about his former wealth, the noble loveliness of his first wife, and the beautiful child whom she had given him. Instead of the fairy tales which other parents tell, he told Priscilla this. And out of the loneliness of her sad little existence, Priscilla's love grew, and tended upward, and twined itself perseveringly around this unseen sister, as a grapevine might strive to clamber out of a gloomy hollow among the rocks, and embrace a young tree standing in the sunny warmth above. It was almost like worship, both in its earnestness and in its humility, nor was it the less humble, though the more earnest, because Priscilla could claim human kindred with the being whom she so devoutly loved. As with worship, too, it gave her soul the refreshment of a purer atmosphere. Save for this singular, this melancholy, and yet beautiful affection, the child could hardly have lived. Or had she lived, with a heart shrunken for lack of any sentiment to fill it, she must have yielded to the barren miseries of her position, and have grown to womanhood characterless and worthless. But now, amid all the sombre coarseness of her father's outward life, and of her own, Priscilla had a higher and imaginative life within. Some faint gleam thereof was often visible upon her face. It was as if, in her spiritual visits to her brilliant sister, a portion of the latter's brightness had permeated our dim Priscilla, and still lingered, shedding a faint illumination through the cheerless chamber, after she came back. As the child grew up, so pallid and so slender, and with much unaccountable nervousness, and all the weakness of neglected infancy still haunting her, the gross and simple neighbors whispered strange things about Priscilla. The big red Irish matrons, whose innumerable progeny swarmed out of the adjacent doors, used to mock at the pale Western child. They fancied, or at least affirmed it between jest and earnest, that she was not so solid flesh and blood as other children, but mixed largely with a thinner element. They called her Ghost Child, and said that she could indeed vanish when she pleased, but could never, in her densest moments, make herself quite visible. The sun at midday would shine through her. In the first gray of the twilight she lost all the distinctness of her outline, and if you followed the dim thing into a dark corner, behold, she was not there. And it was true that Priscilla had strange ways and stranger words when she uttered any words at all. Never stirring out of the old governor's dusky house, she sometimes talked of distant places and splendid rooms as if she had just left them. Hidden things were visible to her, at least so the people inferred from obscure hints escaping unawares out of her mouth, and silence was audible. And in all the world there was nothing so difficult to be endured by those who had any dark secret to conceal, as the glance of Priscilla's timid and melancholy eyes. Her peculiarities were the theme of continual gossip among the other inhabitants of the gubernatorial mansion. The rumor spread thence into a wider circle. Those who knew old Moody, as he was now called, used often to jeer him at the very street corners about his daughter's gift of second sight and prophecy. It was a period when science, though mostly through its empirical professors, was bringing forward anew a horde of facts and imperfect theories that had partially won credence in elder times, but which modern skepticism had swept away as rubbish. These things were now tossed up again out of the surging ocean of human thought and experience. The story of Priscilla's preternatural manifestations, therefore, attracted a kind of notice of which it would have been deemed wholly unworthy a few years earlier. One day a gentleman ascended the creaking staircase, and inquired which was old Moody's chamber door; and several times he came again. He was a marvellously handsome man, still youthful too, and fashionably dressed. Except that Priscilla in those days had no beauty, and in the languor of her existence had not yet blossomed into womanhood, there would have been rich food for scandal in these visits; for the girl was unquestionably their sole object, although her father was supposed always to be present. But it must likewise be added, there was something about Priscilla that calumny could not meddle with; and thus far was she privileged, either by the preponderance of what was spiritual, or the thin and watery blood that left her cheek so pallid. Yet if the busy tongues of the neighborhood spared Priscilla in one way, they made themselves amends by renewed and wilder babble on another score. They averred that the strange gentleman was a wizard, and that he had taken advantage of Priscilla's lack of earthly substance to subject her to himself, as his familiar spirit, through whose medium he gained cognizance of whatever happened in regions near or remote. The boundaries of his power were defined by the verge of the pit of Tartarus on the one hand, and the third sphere of the celestial world on the other. Again, they declared their suspicion that the wizard, with all his show of manly beauty, was really an aged and wizened figure, or else that his semblance of a human body was only a necromantic, or perhaps a mechanical contrivance, in which a demon walked about. In proof of it, however, they could merely instance a gold band around his upper teeth, which had once been visible to several old women when he smiled at them from the top of the governor's staircase. Of course this was all absurdity, or mostly so; but after every possible deduction, there remained certain very mysterious points about the stranger's character, as well as the connection that he established with Priscilla. Its nature at that period was even less understood than now, when miracles of this kind have grown so absolutely stale that I would gladly, if the truth allowed, dismiss the whole matter from my narrative. We must now glance backward in quest of the beautiful daughter of Fauntleroy's prosperity. What had become of her? Fauntleroy's only brother, a bachelor, and with no other relatives so near, had adopted the forsaken child. She grew up in affluence, with native graces clustering luxuriantly about her. In her triumphant progress towards womanhood she was adorned with every variety of feminine accomplishment. But she lacked a mother's care. With no adequate control on any hand, for a man, however stern, however wise, can never sway and guide a female child, her character was left to shape itself. There was good in it, and evil. Passionate, self-willed, and imperious, she had a warm and generous nature, showing the richness of the soil, however, chiefly by the weeds that flourished in it and choked up the herbs of grace. In her girlhood her uncle died. As Fauntleroy was supposed to be likewise dead, and no other heir was known to exist, his wealth devolved on her, although, dying suddenly, the uncle left no will. After his death there were obscure passages in Zenobia's history. There were whispers of an attachment, and even a secret marriage, with a fascinating and accomplished but unprincipled young man. The incidents and appearances, however, which led to this surmise soon passed away and were forgotten. Nor was her reputation seriously affected by the report. In fact, so great was her native power and influence, and such seemed the careless purity of her nature, that whatever Zenobia did was generally acknowledged as right for her to do. The world never criticized her so harshly as it does most women who transcend its rules. It almost yielded its assent, when it beheld her stepping out of the common path, and asserting the more extensive privileges of her sex, both theoretically and by her practice. The sphere of ordinary womanhood was felt to be narrower than her development required. A portion of Zenobia's more recent life is told in the foregoing pages. Partly in earnest, and, I imagine, as was her disposition, half in a proud jest, or in a kind of recklessness that had grown upon her out of some hidden grief, she had given her countenance, and promised liberal pecuniary aid, to our experiment of a better social state. And Priscilla followed her to Blithedale. The sole bliss of her life had been a dream of this beautiful sister, who had never so much as known of her existence. By this time, too, the poor girl was enthralled in an intolerable bondage, from which she must either free herself or perish. She deemed herself safest near Zenobia, into whose large heart she hoped to nestle. One evening, months after Priscilla's departure, when Moody, or shall we call him Fauntleroy, was sitting alone in the state chamber of the old governor, there came footsteps up the staircase. There was a pause on the landing place. A lady's musical yet haughty accents were heard making an inquiry from some denizen of the house, who had thrust a head out of a contiguous chamber. There was then a knock at Moody's door. "Come in," said he. And Zenobia entered. The details of the interview that followed being unknown to me, while notwithstanding it would be a pity quite to lose the picturesqueness of the situation, I shall attempt to sketch it, mainly from fancy, although with some general grounds of surmise in regard to the old man's feelings. She gazed wonderingly at the dismal chamber, dismal to her who beheld it only for an instant, and how much more so to him, into whose brain each bare spot on the ceiling, every tatter of the paper hangings, and all the splintered carvings of the mantelpiece, seen wearily through long years, had worn their several prints. Inexpressibly miserable is this familiarity with objects that have been from the first disgustful. "I have received a strange message," said Zenobia, after a moment's silence, "requesting, or rather enjoining it upon me, to come hither. Rather from curiosity than any other motive, and because, though a woman, I have not all the timidity of one, I have complied. Can it be you, sir, who thus summoned me?" "It was," answered Moody. "And what was your purpose?" she continued. "You require charity, perhaps? In that case the message might have been more fitly worded. But you are old and poor, and age and poverty should be allowed their privileges. Tell me, therefore, to what extent you need my aid." "Put up your purse," said the supposed mendicant, with an inexplicable smile. "Keep it, keep all your wealth, until I demand it all, or none. My message had no such end in view. You are beautiful, they tell me, and I desired to look at you." He took the one lamp that showed the discomfort and sordidness of his abode, and, approaching Zenobia, held it up, so as to gain the more perfect view of her from top to toe. So obscure was the chamber that you could see the reflection of her diamonds thrown upon the dingy wall, and flickering with the rise and fall of Zenobia's breath. It was the splendor of those jewels on her neck, like lamps that burn before some fair temple, and the jeweled flower in her hair, more than the murky yellow light, that helped him to see her beauty. But he beheld it, and grew proud at heart. His own figure, in spite of his mean habiliments, assumed an air of state and grandeur. "It is well!" cried old Moody. "Keep your wealth. You are right worthy of it. Keep it, therefore, but with one condition only." Zenobia thought the old man beside himself, and was moved with pity. "Have you none to care for you?" asked she. "No daughter, no kind hearted neighbor, no means of procuring the attendance which you need? Tell me once again, can I do nothing for you?" "Nothing," he replied. "I have beheld what I wished. Now leave me. Linger not a moment longer, or I may be tempted to say what would bring a cloud over that queenly brow. Keep all your wealth, but with only this one condition: be kind, be no less kind than sisters are, to my poor Priscilla." And it may be, after Zenobia withdrew, Fauntleroy paced his gloomy chamber, and communed with himself as follows, or, at all events, it is the only solution which I can offer of the enigma presented in his character. "I am unchanged, the same man as of yore," said he. "True, my brother's wealth, he dying intestate, is legally my own. I know it, yet of my own choice I live a beggar, and go meanly clad, and hide myself behind a forgotten ignominy. Looks this like ostentation? Ah, but in Zenobia I live again, beholding her so beautiful, so fit to be adorned with all imaginable splendor of outward state, the cursed vanity, which, half a lifetime since, dropped off like tatters of once gaudy apparel from my debased and ruined person, is all renewed for her sake. Were I to reappear, my shame would go with me from darkness into daylight. Zenobia has the splendor, and not the shame. Let the world admire her, and be dazzled by her, the brilliant child of my prosperity. It is Fauntleroy that still shines through her." But then, perhaps, another thought occurred to him. My poor Priscilla! Am I just to her in surrendering all to this beautiful Zenobia? Priscilla! I love her best, I love her only, but with shame, not pride. So dim, so pallid, so shrinking, the daughter of my long calamity! Wealth were but a mockery in Priscilla's hands. What is its use, except to fling a golden radiance around those who grasp it? Yet let Zenobia take heed. Priscilla shall have no wrong. But while the man of show thus meditated, that very evening, so far as I can adjust the dates of these strange incidents, Priscilla, poor pallid flower, was either snatched from Zenobia's hand, or flung wilfully away. Chapter 23. Of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 23. A Village Hall. Well, I betook myself away, and wandered up and down, like an exorcised spirit that had been driven from its old haunts after a mighty struggle. It takes down the solitary pride of man, beyond most other things, to find the impracticability of flinging aside affections that have grown irksome. The bands that were silken once are apt to become iron fetters when we desire to shake them off. Our souls, after all, are not our own. We convey a property in them to those with whom we associate, but to what extent can never be known until we feel the tug, the agony of our abortive effort to resume an exclusive sway over ourselves. Thus, in all the weeks of my absence, my thoughts continually reverted back, brooding over the bygone months, and bringing up incidents that seemed hardly to have left a trace of themselves in their passage. I spent painful hours in recalling these trifles, and rendering them more misty and unsubstantial than at first by the quantity of speculative musing thus kneaded in with them. Hollingsworth, Zenobia, Priscilla. These three had absorbed my life into themselves. Together with an inexpressible longing to know their fortunes, there was likewise a morbid resentment of my own pain, and a stubborn reluctance to come again within their sphere. All that I learned of them, therefore, was comprised in a few brief and pungent squibs, such as the newspapers were then in the habit of bestowing on our socialist enterprise. There was one paragraph, which, if I rightly guessed its purport, bore reference to Zenobia, but was too darkly hinted to convey even thus much of certainty. Hollingsworth, too, with his philanthropic project, afforded the penny a liners a theme for some savage and bloody-minded jokes; and, considerably to my surprise, they affected me with as much indignation as if we had still been friends. Thus passed several weeks, time long enough for my brown and toil-hardened hands to reaccustom themselves to gloves. Old habits, such as were merely external, returned upon me with wonderful promptitude. My superficial talk, too, assumed altogether a worldly tone. Meeting former acquaintances, who showed themselves inclined to ridicule my heroic devotion to the cause of human welfare, I spoke of the recent phase of my life as indeed fair matter for a jest. But I also gave them to understand that it was at most only an experiment, on which I had staked no valuable amount of hope or fear. It had enabled me to pass the summer in a novel and agreeable way, had afforded me some grotesque specimens of artificial simplicity, and could not, therefore, so far as I was concerned, be reckoned a failure. In no one instance, however, did I voluntarily speak of my three friends. They dwelt in a profounder region. The more I consider myself as I then was, the more do I recognize how deeply my connection with those three had affected all my being. As it was already the epoch of annihilated space, I might, in the time I was away from Blithedale, have snatched a glimpse at England, and been back again. But my wanderings were confined within a very limited sphere. I hopped and fluttered like a bird with a string about its leg, gyrating round a small circumference, and keeping up a restless activity to no purpose. Thus it was still in our familiar Massachusetts, in one of its white country villages, that I must next particularize an incident. The scene was one of those lyceum halls, of which almost every village has now its own, dedicated to that sober and pallid, or rather drab colored, mode of winter evening entertainment, the lecture. Of late years this has come strangely into vogue, when the natural tendency of things would seem to be to substitute lettered for oral methods of addressing the public. But in halls like this, besides the winter course of lectures, there is a rich and varied series of other exhibitions. Hither comes the ventriloquist with all his mysterious tongues; the thaumaturgist, too, with his miraculous transformations of plates, doves, and rings, his pancakes smoking in your hat, and his cellar of choice liquors represented in one small bottle. Here, also, the itinerant professor instructs separate classes of ladies and gentlemen in physiology, and demonstrates his lessons by the aid of real skeletons and mannequins in wax from Paris. Here is to be heard the choir of Ethiopian melodists, and to be seen the diorama of Moscow or Bunker Hill, or the moving panorama of the Chinese wall. Here is displayed the museum of wax figures, illustrating the wide Catholicism of earthly renown, by mixing up heroes and statesmen, the Pope and the Mormon prophet, kings, queens, murderers, and beautiful ladies, every sort of person, in short, except authors, of whom I never beheld even the most famous done in wax. And here, in this many-purposed hall, unless the selectmen of the village chance to have more than their share of the Puritanism which, however diversified with later patchwork, still gives its prevailing tint to New England character, here the company of strolling players sets up its little stage, and claims patronage for the legitimate drama. But on the autumnal evening which I speak of, a number of printed handbills, stuck up in the bar room and on the sign post of the hotel, and on the meeting house porch, and distributed largely through the village, had promised the inhabitants an interview with that celebrated and hitherto inexplicable phenomenon, the Veiled Lady. The hall was fitted up with an amphitheatrical descent of seats towards a platform, on which stood a desk, two lights, a stool, and a capacious antique chair. The audience was of a generally decent and respectable character, old farmers in their Sunday black coats, with shrewd, hard, sun-dried faces, and a cynical humor oftener than any other expression in their eyes; pretty girls in many-colored attire; pretty young men, the schoolmaster, the lawyer or student-at-law, the shopkeeper, all looking rather suburban than rural. In these days there is absolutely no rusticity, except when the actual labor of the soil leaves its earth mold on the person. There was likewise a considerable proportion of young and middle-aged women, many of them stern in feature, with marked foreheads, and a very definite line of eyebrow, a type of womanhood in which a bold intellectual development seems to be keeping pace with the progressive delicacy of the physical constitution. Of all these people I took note, at first, according to my custom; but I ceased to do so the moment that my eyes fell on an individual who sat 2 or 3 seats below me, immovable, apparently deep in thought, with his back, of course, towards me, and his face turned steadfastly upon the platform. After sitting a while in contemplation of this person's familiar contour, I was irresistibly moved to step over the intervening benches, lay my hand on his shoulder, put my mouth close to his ear, and address him in a sepulchral, melodramatic whisper: "Hollingsworth, where have you left Zenobia?" His nerves, however, were proof against my attack. He turned half around, and looked me in the face with great sad eyes, in which there was neither kindness nor resentment, nor any perceptible surprise. "Zenobia, when I last saw her," he answered, "was at Blithedale." He said no more; but there was a great deal of talk going on near me, among a knot of people who might be considered as representing the mysticism, or rather the mystic sensuality, of this singular age. The nature of the exhibition that was about to take place had probably given the turn to their conversation. I heard from a pale man in blue spectacles some stranger stories than ever were written in a romance, told, too, with a simple, unimaginative steadfastness which was terribly efficacious in compelling the auditor to receive them into the category of established facts. He cited instances of the miraculous power of one human being over the will and passions of another, insomuch that settled grief was but a shadow beneath the influence of a man possessing this potency, and the strong love of years melted away like a vapor. At the bidding of one of these wizards, the maiden, with her lover's kiss still burning on her lips, would turn from him with icy indifference; the newly made widow would dig up her buried heart out of her young husband's grave before the sods had taken root upon it; a mother with her babe's milk in her bosom would thrust away her child. Human character was but soft wax in his hands, and guilt or virtue only the forms into which he should see fit to mold it. The religious sentiment was a flame which he could blow up with his breath, or a spark that he could utterly extinguish. It is unutterable, the horror and disgust with which I listened, and saw that, if these things were to be believed, the individual soul was virtually annihilated, and all that is sweet and pure in our present life debased, and that the idea of man's eternal responsibility was made ridiculous, and immortality rendered at once impossible and not worth acceptance. But I would have perished on the spot sooner than believe it. The epoch of rapping spirits, and all the wonders that have followed in their train, such as tables upset by invisible agencies, bells self-tolled at funerals, and ghostly music performed on Jews' harps, had not yet arrived. Alas, my countrymen, methinks we have fallen on an evil age. If these phenomena have not humbug at the bottom, so much the worse for us. What can they indicate in a spiritual way, except that the soul of man is descending to a lower point than it has ever before reached while incarnate? We are pursuing a downward course in the eternal march, and thus bring ourselves into the same range with beings whom death, in requital of their gross and evil lives, has degraded below humanity. To hold intercourse with spirits of this order, we must stoop and grovel in some element more vile than earthly dust. These goblins, if they exist at all, are but the shadows of past mortality, outcasts, mere refuse stuff, adjudged unworthy of the eternal world, and, on the most favorable supposition, dwindling gradually into nothingness. The less we have to say to them, the better, lest we share their fate. The audience now began to be impatient. They signified their desire for the entertainment to commence by thump of sticks and stamp of boot heels. Nor was it a great while longer before, in response to their call, there appeared a bearded personage in oriental robes, looking like one of the enchanters of the Arabian Nights. He came upon the platform from a side door, saluted the spectators, not with a salaam, but with a bow, took his station at the desk, and, first blowing his nose with a white handkerchief, prepared to speak. The environment of the homely village hall, and the absence of many ingenious contrivances of stage effect with which the exhibition had heretofore been set off, seemed to bring the artifice of this character more openly upon the surface. No sooner did I behold the bearded enchanter, than, laying my hand again on Hollingsworth's shoulder, I whispered in his ear, "Do you know him?" "I never saw the man before," he muttered, without turning his head. But I had seen him 3 times already. Once on occasion of my first visit to the Veiled Lady, a second time in the wood path at Blithedale, and lastly in Zenobia's drawing room. It was Westervelt. A quick association of ideas made me shudder from head to foot, and again, like an evil spirit bringing up reminiscences of a man's sins, I whispered a question in Hollingsworth's ear. "What have you done with Priscilla?" He gave a convulsive start, as if I had thrust a knife into him, writhed himself round on his seat, glared fiercely into my eyes, but answered not a word. The Professor began his discourse, explanatory of the psychological phenomena, as he termed them, which it was his purpose to exhibit to the spectators. There remains no very distinct impression of it on my memory. It was eloquent, ingenious, plausible, with a delusive show of spirituality, yet really imbued throughout with a cold and dead materialism. I shivered, as at a current of chill air issuing out of a sepulchral vault, and bringing the smell of corruption along with it. He spoke of a new era that was dawning upon the world, an era that would link soul to soul, and the present life to what we call futurity, with a closeness that should finally convert both worlds into one great, mutually conscious brotherhood. He described, in a strange philosophical guise, with terms of art, as if it were a matter of chemical discovery, the agency by which this mighty result was to be effected. Nor would it have surprised me, had he pretended to hold up a portion of his universally pervasive fluid, as he affirmed it to be, in a glass phial. At the close of his exordium the Professor beckoned with his hand, once, twice, thrice, and a figure came gliding upon the platform, enveloped in a long veil of silvery whiteness. It fell about her like the texture of a summer cloud, with a kind of vagueness, so that the outline of the form beneath it could not be accurately discerned. But the movement of the Veiled Lady was graceful, free, and unembarrassed, like that of a person accustomed to be the spectacle of thousands, or possibly a blindfold prisoner within the sphere with which this dark earthly magician had surrounded her, she was wholly unconscious of being the central object to all those straining eyes. Pliant to his gesture, which had even an obsequious courtesy, but at the same time a remarkable decisiveness, the figure placed itself in the great chair. Sitting there in such visible obscurity, it was, perhaps, as much like the actual presence of a disembodied spirit as anything that stage trickery could devise. The hushed breathing of the spectators proved how high wrought were their anticipations of the wonders to be performed through the medium of this incomprehensible creature. I, too, was in breathless suspense, but with a far different presentiment of some strange event at hand. "You see before you the Veiled Lady," said the bearded Professor, advancing to the verge of the platform. "By the agency of which I have just spoken, she is at this moment in communion with the spiritual world. That silvery veil is, in one sense, an enchantment, having been dipped, as it were, and essentially imbued, through the potency of my art, with the fluid medium of spirits. Slight and ethereal as it seems, the limitations of time and space have no existence within its folds. This hall, these hundreds of faces, encompassing her within so narrow an amphitheatre, are of thinner substance, in her view, than the airiest vapor that the clouds are made of. She beholds the Absolute." As preliminary to other and far more wonderful psychological experiments, the exhibitor suggested that some of his auditors should endeavor to make the Veiled Lady sensible of their presence by such methods, provided only no touch were laid upon her person, as they might deem best adapted to that end. Accordingly, several deep-lunged country fellows, who looked as if they might have blown the apparition away with a breath, ascended the platform. Mutually encouraging one another, they shouted so close to her ear that the veil stirred like a wreath of vanishing mist. They smote upon the floor with bludgeons. They perpetrated so hideous a clamor that methought it might have reached, at least a little way, into the eternal sphere. Finally, with the assent of the Professor, they laid hold of the great chair, and were startled, apparently, to find it soar upward, as if lighter than the air through which it rose. But the Veiled Lady remained seated and motionless, with a composure that was hardly less than awful, because implying so immeasurable a distance betwixt her and these rude persecutors. "These efforts are wholly without avail," observed the Professor, who had been looking on with an aspect of serene indifference. "The roar of a battery of cannon would be inaudible to the Veiled Lady; and yet, were I to will it, sitting in this very hall, she could hear the desert wind sweeping over the sands as far off as Arabia, the icebergs grinding one against the other in the polar seas, the rustle of a leaf in an East Indian forest, the lowest whispered breath of the bashfulest maiden in the world, uttering the first confession of her love. Nor does there exist the moral inducement, apart from my own behest, that could persuade her to lift the silvery veil, or arise out of that chair." Greatly to the Professor's discomposure, however, just as he spoke these words, the Veiled Lady arose. There was a mysterious tremor that shook the magic veil. The spectators, it may be, imagined that she was about to take flight into that invisible sphere, and to the society of those purely spiritual beings with whom they reckoned her so near akin. Hollingsworth, a moment ago, had mounted the platform, and now stood gazing at the figure, with a sad intentness that brought the whole power of his great, stern, yet tender soul into his glance. "Come," said he, waving his hand towards her, "you are safe." She threw off the veil, and stood before that multitude of people, pale, tremulous, shrinking, as if only then had she discovered that 1,000 eyes were gazing at her. Poor maiden, how strangely had she been betrayed! Blazoned abroad as a wonder of the world, and performing what were adjudged as miracles, in the faith of many a seeress, a prophetess, in the harsher judgment of others a mountebank. She had kept, as I religiously believe, her virgin reserve and sanctity of soul throughout it all. Within that encircling veil, though an evil hand had flung it over her, there was as deep a seclusion as if this forsaken girl had, all the while, been sitting under the shadow of Eliot's pulpit in the Blithedale woods, at the feet of him who now summoned her to the shelter of his arms. And the true heart-throb of a woman's affection was too powerful for the jugglery that had hitherto environed her. She uttered a shriek, and fled to Hollingsworth, like one escaping from her deadliest enemy, and was safe forever. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 24. The Masqueraders. 2 nights had passed since the foregoing occurrences, when, in a breezy September forenoon, I set forth from town on foot towards Blithedale. It was the most delightful of all days for a walk, with a dash of invigorating ice temper in the air, but a coolness that soon gave place to the brisk glow of exercise, while the vigor remained as elastic as before. The atmosphere had a spirit and a sparkle in it. Each breath was like a sip of ethereal wine, tempered, as I said, with a crystal lump of ice. I had started on this expedition in an exceedingly sombre mood, as well befitted one who found himself tending towards home, but was conscious that nobody would be quite overjoyed to greet him there. My feet were hardly off the pavement, however, when this morbid sensation began to yield to the lively influences of air and motion. Nor had I gone far, with the fields yet green on either side, before my step became as swift and light as if Hollingsworth were waiting to exchange a friendly hand grip, and Zenobia's and Priscilla's open arms would welcome the wanderer's reappearance. It has happened to me on other occasions as well as this, to prove how a state of physical well being can create a kind of joy, in spite of the profoundest anxiety of mind. The pathway of that walk still runs along with sunny freshness through my memory. I know not why it should be so, but my mental eye can even now discern the September grass, bordering the pleasant roadside with a brighter verdure than while the summer heats were scorching it; the trees, too, mostly green, although here and there a branch or shrub has donned its vesture of crimson and gold a week or two before its fellows. I see the tufted barberry bushes, with their small clusters of scarlet fruit; the toadstools likewise, some spotlessly white, others yellow or red, mysterious growths, springing suddenly from no root or seed, and growing nobody can tell how or wherefore. In this respect they resembled many of the emotions in my breast. And I still see the little rivulets, chill, clear, and bright, that murmured beneath the road through subterranean rocks, and deepened into mossy pools where tiny fish were darting to and fro, and within which lurked the hermit frog. But no, I never can account for it, that, with a yearning interest to learn the upshot of all my story, and returning to Blithedale for that sole purpose, I should examine these things so like a peaceful bosomed naturalist; nor why, amid all my sympathies and fears, there shot at times a wild exhilaration through my frame. Thus I pursued my way along the line of the ancient stone wall that Paul Dudley built, and through white villages, and past orchards of ruddy apples, and fields of ripening maize, and patches of woodland, and all such sweet rural scenery as looks the fairest a little beyond the suburbs of a town. Hollingsworth, Zenobia, Priscilla, they glided mistily before me as I walked. Sometimes in my solitude I laughed with the bitterness of self scorn, remembering how unreservedly I had given up my heart and soul to interests that were not mine. What had I ever had to do with them? And why, being now free, should I take this thraldom on me once again? It was both sad and dangerous, I whispered to myself, to be in too close affinity with the passions, the errors, and the misfortunes of individuals who stood within a circle of their own, into which, if I stepped at all, it must be as an intruder, and at a peril that I could not estimate. Drawing nearer to Blithedale, a sickness of the spirits kept alternating with my flights of causeless buoyancy. I indulged in 100 odd and extravagant conjectures. Either there was no such place as Blithedale, nor ever had been, nor any brotherhood of thoughtful laborers, like what I seemed to recollect there, or else it was all changed during my absence. It had been nothing but dream work and enchantment. I should seek in vain for the old farmhouse, and for the greensward, the potato fields, the root crops, and acres of Indian corn, and for all that configuration of the land which I had imagined. It would be another spot, and an utter strangeness. These vagaries were of the spectral throng so apt to steal out of an unquiet heart. They partly ceased to haunt me on my arriving at a point whence, through the trees, I began to catch glimpses of the Blithedale farm. That surely was something real. There was hardly a square foot of all those acres on which I had not trodden heavily in one or another kind of toil. The curse of Adam's posterity, and, curse or blessing be it, it gives substance to the life around us, had first come upon me there. In the sweat of my brow I had there earned bread and eaten it, and so established my claim to be on earth, and my fellowship with all the sons of labor. I could have knelt down and have laid my breast against that soil. The red clay of which my frame was molded seemed nearer akin to those crumbling furrows than to any other portion of the world's dust. There was my home, and there might be my grave. I felt an invincible reluctance, nevertheless, at the idea of presenting myself before my old associates, without first ascertaining the state in which they were. A nameless foreboding weighed upon me. Perhaps, should I know all the circumstances that had occurred, I might find it my wisest course to turn back, unrecognized, unseen, and never look at Blithedale more. Had it been evening, I would have stolen softly to some lighted window of the old farmhouse, and peeped darkling in, to see all their well known faces round the supper board. Then, were there a vacant seat, I might noiselessly unclose the door, glide in, and take my place among them without a word. My entrance might be so quiet, my aspect so familiar, that they would forget how long I had been away, and suffer me to melt into the scene, as a wreath of vapor melts into a larger cloud. I dreaded a boisterous greeting. Beholding me at table, Zenobia, as a matter of course, would send me a cup of tea, and Hollingsworth fill my plate from the great dish of pandowdy, and Priscilla, in her quiet way, would hand the cream, and others help me to the bread and butter. Being one of them again, the knowledge of what had happened would come to me without a shock. For still, at every turn of my shifting fantasies, the thought stared me in the face that some evil thing had befallen us, or was ready to befall. Yielding to this ominous impression, I now turned aside into the woods, resolving to spy out the posture of the community as craftily as the wild Indian before he makes his onset. I would go wandering about the outskirts of the farm, and, perhaps catching sight of a solitary acquaintance, would approach him amid the brown shadows of the trees, a kind of medium fit for spirits departed and revisitant like myself, and entreat him to tell me how all things were. The first living creature that I met was a partridge, which sprung up beneath my feet and whirred away. The next was a squirrel, who chattered angrily at me from an overhanging bough. I trod along by the dark, sluggish river, and remember pausing on the bank, above one of its blackest and most placid pools, the very spot, with the barkless stump of a tree aslantwise over the water, is depicting itself to my fancy at this instant, and wondering how deep it was, and if any overladen soul had ever flung its weight of mortality in thither, and if it thus escaped the burden, or only made it heavier. And perhaps the skeleton of the drowned wretch still lay beneath the inscrutable depth, clinging to some sunken log at the bottom with the gripe of its old despair. So slight, however, was the track of these gloomy ideas, that I soon forgot them in the contemplation of a brood of wild ducks which were floating on the river, and anon took flight, leaving each a bright streak over the black surface. By and by I came to my hermitage in the heart of the white pine tree, and clambering up into it, sat down to rest. The grapes which I had watched throughout the summer now dangled around me in abundant clusters of the deepest purple, deliciously sweet to the taste, and though wild, yet free from that ungentle flavor which distinguishes nearly all our native and uncultivated grapes. Methought a wine might be pressed out of them possessing a passionate zest, and endowed with a new kind of intoxicating quality, attended with such bacchanalian ecstasies as the tamer grapes of Madeira, France, and the Rhine are inadequate to produce. And I longed to quaff a great goblet of it at that moment. While devouring the grapes, I looked on all sides out of the peepholes of my hermitage, and saw the farmhouse, the fields, and almost every part of our domain, but not a single human figure in the landscape. Some of the windows of the house were open, but with no more signs of life than in a dead man's unshut eyes. The barn door was ajar, and swinging in the breeze. The big old dog, he was a relic of the former dynasty of the farm, that hardly ever stirred out of the yard, was nowhere to be seen. What, then, had become of all the fraternity and sisterhood? Curious to ascertain this point, I let myself down out of the tree, and, going to the edge of the wood, was glad to perceive our herd of cows chewing the cud or grazing not far off. I fancied by their manner that 2 or 3 of them recognized me, as indeed they ought, for I had milked them and been their chamberlain times without number; but after staring me in the face a little while, they phlegmatically began grazing and chewing their cuds again. Then I grew foolishly angry at so cold a reception, and flung some rotten fragments of an old stump at these unsentimental cows. Skirting farther round the pasture, I heard voices and much laughter proceeding from the interior of the wood. Voices, male and feminine; laughter not only of fresh young throats, but the bass of grown people, as if solemn pipe organs should pour out airs of merriment. Not a voice spoke but I knew it better than my own; not a laugh but its cadences were familiar. The wood, in this portion of it, seemed as full of jollity as if Comus and his crew were holding their revels in one of its usually lonesome glades. Stealing onward as far as I durst, without hazard of discovery, I saw a concourse of strange figures beneath the overshadowing branches. They appeared and vanished, and came again confusedly, with the streaks of sunlight glimmering down upon them. Among them was an Indian chief, with blanket, feathers, and war paint, and uplifted tomahawk; and near him, looking fit to be his woodland bride, the goddess Diana, with the crescent on her head, and attended by our big lazy dog, in lack of any fleeter hound. Drawing an arrow from her quiver, she let it fly at a venture, and hit the very tree behind which I happened to be lurking. Another group consisted of a Bavarian broom girl, a negro of the Jim Crow order, 1 or 2 foresters of the Middle Ages, a Kentucky woodsman in his trimmed hunting shirt and deerskin leggings, and a Shaker elder, quaint, demure, broad brimmed, and square skirted. Shepherds of Arcadia and allegoric figures from the Faery Queen were oddly mixed up with these. arm in arm, or otherwise huddled together in strange discrepancy, stood grim Puritans, gay Cavaliers, and Revolutionary officers with three-cornered cocked hats and queues longer than their swords. A bright complexioned, dark haired, vivacious little gypsy, with a red shawl over her head, went from one group to another telling fortunes by palmistry, and Moll Pitcher, the renowned old Witch of Lynn, broomstick in hand, showed herself prominently in the midst, as if announcing all these apparitions to be the offspring of her necromantic art. But Silas Foster, who leaned against a tree near by, in his customary blue frock, and smoking a short pipe, did more to disenchant the scene with his look of shrewd, acrid Yankee observation, than 20 witches and necromancers could have done in the way of rendering it weird and fantastic. A little farther off, some old fashioned skinkers and drawers, all with portentously red noses, were spreading a banquet on the leaf strewn earth, while a horned and long tailed gentleman, in whom I recognized the fiendish musician erst seen by Tam O'Shanter, tuned his fiddle, and summoned the whole motley rout to a dance, before partaking of the festal cheer. So they joined hands in a circle, whirling round so swiftly, so madly, and so merrily, in time and tune with the Satanic music, that their separate incongruities were blended all together, and they became a kind of entanglement that went nigh to turn one's brain with merely looking at it. Anon they stopped all of a sudden, and, staring at one another's figures, set up a roar of laughter, whereat a shower of the September leaves, which all day long had been hesitating whether to fall or no, were shaken off by the movement of the air, and came eddying down upon the revellers. Then, for lack of breath, ensued a silence, at the deepest point of which, tickled by the oddity of surprising my grave associates in this masquerading trim, I could not possibly refrain from a burst of laughter on my own separate account. "Hush!" I heard the pretty gypsy fortune teller say. "Who is that laughing?" "Some profane intruder," said the goddess Diana. "I shall send an arrow through his heart, or change him into a stag, as I did Actaeon, if he peeps from behind the trees." "Me take his scalp!" cried the Indian chief, brandishing his tomahawk, and cutting a great caper in the air. "I'll root him in the earth with a spell that I have at my tongue's end," squeaked Moll Pitcher, "and the green moss shall grow all over him before he gets free again." "The voice was Miles Coverdale's," said the fiendish fiddler, with a whisk of his tail and a toss of his horns. "My music has brought him hither. He is always ready to dance to the devil's tune." Thus put on the right track, they all recognized the voice at once, and set up a simultaneous shout. "Miles! Miles! Miles Coverdale, where are you?" they cried. "Zenobia! Queen Zenobia! Here is one of your vassals, lurking in the wood. Command him to approach, and pay his duty." The whole fantastic rabble forthwith streamed off in pursuit of me, so that I was like a mad poet hunted by chimeras. Having fairly the start of them, however, I succeeded in making my escape, and soon left their merriment and riot at a good distance in the rear. Its fainter tones assumed a kind of mournfulness, and were finally lost in the hush and solemnity of the wood. In my haste, I stumbled over a heap of logs and sticks that had been cut for firewood a great while ago by some former possessor of the soil, and piled up square in order to be carted or sledded away to the farmhouse. But being forgotten, they had lain there perhaps 50 years, and possibly much longer, until, by the accumulation of moss, and the leaves falling over them and decaying there from autumn to autumn, a green mound was formed, in which the softened outline of the woodpile was still perceptible. In the fitful mood that then swayed my mind, I found something strangely affecting in this simple circumstance. I imagined the long dead woodman, and his long dead wife and children, coming out of their chill graves, and essaying to make a fire with this heap of mossy fuel. From this spot I strayed onward, quite lost in reverie, and neither knew nor cared whither I was going, until a low, soft, well remembered voice spoke at a little distance. "There is Mr. Coverdale." "Miles Coverdale," said another voice, and its tones were very stern. "Let him come forward, then." "Yes, Mr. Coverdale," cried a woman's voice, clear and melodious, but just then with something unnatural in its chord. "You are welcome. But you come half an hour too late, and have missed a scene which you would have enjoyed." I looked up, and found myself nigh Eliot's pulpit, at the base of which sat Hollingsworth, with Priscilla at his feet, and Zenobia standing before them. Chapter 25 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 25. The Three Together. Hollingsworth was in his ordinary working dress. Priscilla wore a pretty and simple gown with a kerchief about her neck, and a calash which she had flung back from her head, leaving it suspended by the strings. But Zenobia, whose part among the maskers, as may be supposed, was no inferior one, appeared in a costume of fanciful magnificence, with her jewelled flower as the central ornament of what resembled a leafy crown or coronet. She represented the Oriental princess by whose name we were accustomed to know her. Her attitude was free and noble, yet, if a queen's, it was not that of a queen triumphant, but dethroned, on trial for her life, or, perchance, condemned already. The spirit of the conflict seemed, nevertheless, to be alive in her. Her eyes were on fire; her cheeks had each a crimson spot, so exceedingly vivid, and marked with so definite an outline, that I at first doubted whether it were not artificial. In a very brief space, however, this idea was shamed by the paleness that ensued, as the blood sunk suddenly away. Zenobia now looked like marble. One always feels the fact in an instant when he is intruded on those who love or those who hate, at some acme of their passion that puts them into a sphere of their own, where no other spirit can pretend to stand on equal ground with them. I was confused, affected even with a species of terror, and wished myself away. The intenseness of their feelings gave them the exclusive property of the soil and atmosphere, and left me no right to be or breathe there. "Hollingsworth, Zenobia, I have just returned to Blithedale," said I, "and had no thought of finding you here. We shall meet again at the house. I will retire." "This place is free to you," answered Hollingsworth. "As free as to ourselves," added Zenobia. "This long while past you have been following up your game, groping for human emotions in the dark corners of the heart. Had you been here a little sooner, you might have seen them dragged into the daylight. I could even wish to have my trial over again, with you standing by to see fair play. Do you know, Mr. Coverdale, I have been on trial for my life?" She laughed while speaking thus; but in truth, as my eyes wandered from one of the group to another, I saw in Hollingsworth all that an artist could desire for the grim portrait of a Puritan magistrate, holding inquest of life and death in a case of witchcraft; in Zenobia, the sorceress herself, not aged, wrinkled, and decrepit, but fair enough to tempt Satan with a force reciprocal to his own; and in Priscilla, the pale victim whose soul and body had been wasted by her spells. Had a pile of fagots been heaped against the rock, this hint of impending doom would have completed the suggestive picture. "It was too hard upon me," continued Zenobia, addressing Hollingsworth, "that judge, jury, and accuser should all be comprehended in one man. I demur, as I think the lawyers say, to the jurisdiction. But let the learned Judge Coverdale seat himself on the top of the rock, and you and me stand at its base, side by side, pleading our cause before him. There might at least be two criminals instead of one." "You forced this on me," replied Hollingsworth, looking her sternly in the face. "Did I call you hither from among the masqueraders yonder? Do I assume to be your judge? No, except as far as I have an unquestionable right of judgment, in order to settle my own line of behavior towards those with whom the events of life bring me in contact. True, I have already judged you, but not on the world's part, neither do I pretend to pass a sentence." "Ah, this is very good!" cried Zenobia, with a smile. "What strange beings you men are, Mr. Coverdale, is it not so? It is the simplest thing in the world with you to bring a woman before your secret tribunals, and judge and condemn her unheard, and then tell her to go free without a sentence. The misfortune is that this same secret tribunal chances to be the only judgment seat that a true woman stands in awe of, and that any verdict short of acquittal is equivalent to a death sentence." The more I looked at them, and the more I heard, the stronger grew my impression that a crisis had just come and gone. On Hollingsworth's brow it had left a stamp like that of irrevocable doom, of which his own will was the instrument. In Zenobia's whole person, beholding her more closely, I saw a riotous agitation, the almost delirious disquietude of a great struggle, at the close of which the vanquished one felt her strength and courage still mighty within her, and longed to renew the contest. My sensations were as if I had come upon a battlefield before the smoke was as yet cleared away. And what subjects had been discussed here? All, no doubt, that for so many months past had kept my heart and my imagination idly feverish. Zenobia's whole character and history, the true nature of her mysterious connection with Westervelt, her later purposes towards Hollingsworth, and reciprocally his in reference to her, and finally the degree in which Zenobia had been cognizant of the plot against Priscilla, and what at last had been the real object of that scheme. On these points, as before, I was left to my own conjectures. One thing only was certain: Zenobia and Hollingsworth were friends no longer. If their heartstrings were ever intertwined, the knot had been adjudged an entanglement, and was now violently broken. But Zenobia seemed unable to rest content with the matter in the posture which it had assumed. "Ah, do we part so?" exclaimed she, seeing Hollingsworth about to retire. "And why not?" said he, with almost rude abruptness. "What is there further to be said between us?" "Well, perhaps nothing," answered Zenobia, looking him in the face, and smiling. "But we have come many times before to this gray rock, and we have talked very softly among the whisperings of the birch trees. They were pleasant hours. I love to make the latest of them, though not altogether so delightful, loiter away as slowly as may be. And besides, you have put many queries to me at this, which you design to be our last interview, and being driven, as I must acknowledge, into a corner, I have responded with reasonable frankness. But now, with your free consent, I desire the privilege of asking a few questions in my turn." "I have no concealment," said Hollingsworth. "We shall see," answered Zenobia. "I would first inquire whether you have supposed me to be wealthy." "On that point," observed Hollingsworth, "I have had the opinion which the world holds." "And I held it likewise," said Zenobia. "Had I not, Heaven is my witness, the knowledge should have been as free to you as me. It is only 3 days since I knew the strange fact that threatens to make me poor; and your own acquaintance with it, I suspect, is of at least as old a date. I fancied myself affluent. You are aware, too, of the disposition which I purposed making of the larger portion of my imaginary opulence. Nay, were it all, I had not hesitated. Let me ask you further, did I ever propose or intimate any terms of compact on which depended this, as the world would consider it, so important sacrifice?" "You certainly spoke of none," said Hollingsworth. "Nor meant any," she responded. "I was willing to realize your dream freely, generously, as some might think, but at all events fully, and heedless though it should prove the ruin of my fortune. If in your own thoughts you have imposed any conditions of this expenditure, it is you that must be held responsible for whatever is sordid and unworthy in them. And now one other question. Do you love this girl?" "O Zenobia!" exclaimed Priscilla, shrinking back as if looking for the rock to topple over and hide her. "Do you love her?" repeated Zenobia. "Had you asked me that question a short time since," replied Hollingsworth, after a pause, during which it seemed to me even the birch trees held their whispering breath, "I should have told you no. My feelings for Priscilla differed little from those of an elder brother, watching tenderly over the gentle sister whom God has given him to protect." "And what is your answer now?" persisted Zenobia. "I do love her," said Hollingsworth, uttering the words with a deep inward breath, instead of speaking them outright. "As well declare it thus as in any other way. I do love her." "Now God be judge between us!" cried Zenobia, breaking into sudden passion. "Which of us two has most mortally offended him? At least, I am a woman with every fault it may be that a woman ever had, weak, vain, unprincipled, like most of my sex, for our virtues, when we have any, are merely impulsive and intuitive, passionate, too, and pursuing my foolish and unattainable ends by indirect and cunning, though absurdly chosen, means, as an hereditary bond slave must; false, moreover, to the whole circle of good, in my reckless truth to the little good I saw before me; but still a woman, a creature whom only a little change of earthly fortune, a little kinder smile of Him who sent me hither, and one true heart to encourage and direct me, might have made all that a woman can be. But how is it with you? Are you a man? No, but a monster, a cold, heartless, self beginning and self ending piece of mechanism." "With what, then, do you charge me?" asked Hollingsworth, aghast, and greatly disturbed by this attack. "Show me one selfish end in all I ever aimed at, and you may cut it out of my bosom with a knife." "It is all self," answered Zenobia, with still intenser bitterness. "Nothing else, nothing but self, self, self! The fiend, I doubt not, has made his choicest mirth of you these 7 years past, and especially in the mad summer which we have spent together. I see it now. I am awake, disenchanted, disenthralled. Self, self, self! You have embodied yourself in a project. You are a better masquerader than the witches and gypsies yonder, for your disguise is a self deception. See whither it has brought you. First, you aimed a death blow, and a treacherous one, at this scheme of a purer and higher life, which so many noble spirits had wrought out. Then, because Coverdale could not be quite your slave, you threw him ruthlessly away. And you took me, too, into your plan, as long as there was hope of my being available, and now fling me aside again, a broken tool. But foremost and blackest of your sins, you stifled down your inmost consciousness. You did a deadly wrong to your own heart. You were ready to sacrifice this girl, whom, if God ever visibly showed a purpose, He put into your charge, and through whom He was striving to redeem you." "This is a woman's view," said Hollingsworth, growing deadly pale, "a woman's, whose whole sphere of action is in the heart, and who can conceive of no higher nor wider one." "Be silent!" cried Zenobia imperiously. "You know neither man nor woman. The utmost that can be said in your behalf, and because I would not be wholly despicable in my own eyes, but would fain excuse my wasted feelings, nor own it wholly a delusion, therefore I say it, is that a great and rich heart has been ruined in your breast. Leave me now. You have done with me, and I with you. Farewell!" "Priscilla," said Hollingsworth, "come." Zenobia smiled. Possibly I did so, too. Not often, in human life, has a gnawing sense of injury found a sweeter morsel of revenge than was conveyed in the tone with which Hollingsworth spoke those 2 words. It was the abased and tremulous tone of a man whose faith in himself was shaken, and who sought at last to lean on an affection. Yes, the strong man bowed himself and rested on this poor Priscilla. Oh, could she have failed him, what a triumph for the lookers on! And at first I half imagined that she was about to fail him. She rose up, stood shivering like the birch leaves that trembled over her head, and then slowly tottered rather than walked towards Zenobia. Arriving at her feet, she sank down there, in the very same attitude which she had assumed on their first meeting in the kitchen of the old farmhouse. Zenobia remembered it. "Ah, Priscilla," said she, shaking her head, "how much is changed since then! You kneel to a dethroned princess, you, the victorious one. But he is waiting for you. Say what you wish, and leave me." "We are sisters," gasped Priscilla. I fancied that I understood the word and action. It meant the offering of herself and all she had, to be at Zenobia's disposal. But the latter would not take it thus. "True, we are sisters," she replied; and, moved by the sweet word, she stooped down and kissed Priscilla, but not lovingly, for a sense of fatal harm received through her seemed to be lurking in Zenobia's heart. "We had one father. You knew it from the first, I but a little while. Else some things that have chanced might have been spared you. But I never wished you harm. You stood between me and an end which I desired. I wanted a clear path. No matter what I meant. It is over now. Do you forgive me?" "O Zenobia," sobbed Priscilla, "it is I that feel like the guilty one." "No, no, poor little thing," said Zenobia, with a sort of contempt. "You have been my evil fate, but there never was a babe with less strength or will to do an injury. Poor child, methinks you have but a melancholy lot before you, sitting all alone in that wide, cheerless heart, where, for aught you know, and as I, alas, believe, the fire which you have kindled may soon go out. Ah, the thought makes me shiver for you. What will you do, Priscilla, when you find no spark among the ashes?" "Die," she answered. "That was well said," responded Zenobia, with an approving smile. "There is all a woman in your little compass, my poor sister. Meanwhile, go with him and live." She waved her away with a queenly gesture, and turned her own face to the rock. I watched Priscilla, wondering what judgment she would pass between Zenobia and Hollingsworth, how interpret his behavior so as to reconcile it with true faith both towards her sister and herself, how compel her love for him to keep any terms whatever with her sisterly affection. But in truth there was no such difficulty as I imagined. Her engrossing love made it all clear. Hollingsworth could have no fault. That was the one principle at the centre of the universe. And the doubtful guilt or possible integrity of other people, appearances, self evident facts, the testimony of her own senses, even Hollingsworth's self accusation, had he volunteered it, would have weighed not the value of a mote of thistledown on the other side. So secure was she of his right, that she never thought of comparing it with another's wrong, but left the latter to itself. Hollingsworth drew her arm within his, and soon disappeared with her among the trees. I cannot imagine how Zenobia knew when they were out of sight; she never glanced again towards them. But, retaining a proud attitude so long as they might have thrown back a retiring look, they were no sooner departed, utterly departed, than she began slowly to sink down. It was as if a great, invisible, irresistible weight were pressing her to the earth. Settling upon her knees, she leaned her forehead against the rock, and sobbed convulsively. Dry sobs they seemed to be, such as have nothing to do with tears. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 26. Zenobia and Coverdale. Zenobia had entirely forgotten me. She fancied herself alone with her great grief. And had it been only a common pity that I felt for her, the pity that her proud nature would have repelled as the one worst wrong which the world yet held in reserve, the sacredness and awfulness of the crisis might have impelled me to steal away silently, so that not a dry leaf should rustle under my feet. I would have left her there to struggle, in that solitude, with only the eye of God upon her. But so it happened, I never once dreamed of questioning my right to be there now, as I had questioned it just before, when I came so suddenly upon Hollingsworth and herself in the passion of their recent debate. It suits me not to explain what was the analogy that I saw or imagined between Zenobia's situation and mine. Nor, I believe, will the reader detect this one secret, hidden beneath many a revelation which perhaps concerned me less. In simple truth, however, as Zenobia leaned her forehead against the rock, shaken with that tearless agony, it seemed to me that the selfsame pang, with hardly mitigated torment, leaped thrilling from her heartstrings to my own. Was it wrong, therefore, if I felt myself consecrated to the priesthood by sympathy like this, and called upon to minister to this woman's affliction, so far as mortal could? But, indeed, what could mortal do for her? Nothing. The attempt would be a mockery and an anguish. Time, it is true, would steal away her grief, and bury it and the best of her heart in the same grave. But destiny itself, methought, in its kindliest mood, could do no better for Zenobia, in the way of quick relief, than to cause the impending rock to impend a little farther, and fall upon her head. So I leaned against a tree, and listened to her sobs in unbroken silence. She was half prostrate, half kneeling, with her forehead still pressed against the rock. Her sobs were the only sound. She did not groan, nor give any other utterance to her distress. It was all involuntary. At length she sat up, put back her hair, and stared about her with a bewildered aspect, as if not distinctly recollecting the scene through which she had passed, nor cognizant of the situation in which it left her. Her face and brow were almost purple with the rush of blood. They whitened, however, by and by, and for some time retained this deathlike hue. She put her hand to her forehead, with a gesture that made me forcibly conscious of an intense and living pain there. Her glance, wandering wildly to and fro, passed over me several times without appearing to inform her of my presence. But finally a look of recognition gleamed from her eyes into mine. "Is it you, Miles Coverdale?" said she, smiling. "Ah, I perceive what you are about. You are turning this whole affair into a ballad. Pray let me hear as many stanzas as you happen to have ready." "Oh, hush, Zenobia!" I answered. "Heaven knows what an ache is in my soul." "It is genuine tragedy, is it not?" rejoined Zenobia, with a sharp, light laugh. "And you are willing to allow, perhaps, that I have had hard measure? But it is a woman's doom, and I have deserved it like a woman. So let there be no pity, as, on my part, there shall be no complaint. It is all right now, or will shortly be so. But, Mr. Coverdale, by all means write this ballad, and put your soul's ache into it, and turn your sympathy to good account, as other poets do, and as poets must, unless they choose to give us glittering icicles instead of lines of fire. As for the moral, it shall be distilled into the final stanza, in a drop of bitter honey." "What shall it be, Zenobia?" I inquired, endeavoring to fall in with her mood. "Oh, a very old one will serve the purpose," she replied. "There are no new truths, much as we have prided ourselves on finding some. A moral? Why, this: that in the battlefield of life the downright stroke, that would fall only on a man's steel headpiece, is sure to light on a woman's heart, over which she wears no breastplate, and whose wisdom it is, therefore, to keep out of the conflict. Or this: that the whole universe, her own sex and yours, and Providence or Destiny to boot, make common cause against the woman who swerves one hair's breadth out of the beaten track. Yes, and add, for I may as well own it now, that with that one hair's breadth she goes all astray, and never sees the world in its true aspect afterwards." "This last is too stern a moral," I observed. "Cannot we soften it a little?" "Do it, if you like, at your own peril, not on my responsibility," she answered. Then, with a sudden change of subject, she went on, "After all, he has flung away what would have served him better than the poor pale flower he kept. What can Priscilla do for him? Put passionate warmth into his heart when it shall be chilled with frozen hopes? Strengthen his hands when they are weary with much doing and no performance? No, but only tend towards him with a blind, instinctive love, and hang her little, puny weakness for a clog upon his arm. She cannot even give him such sympathy as is worth the name; for will he never, in many an hour of darkness, need that proud intellectual sympathy which he might have had from me, the sympathy that would flash light along his course, and guide as well as cheer him? Poor Hollingsworth! Where will he find it now?" "Hollingsworth has a heart of ice," said I bitterly. "He is a wretch." "Do him no wrong," interrupted Zenobia, turning haughtily upon me. "Presume not to estimate a man like Hollingsworth. It was my fault all along, and none of his. I see it now. He never sought me. Why should he seek me? What had I to offer him? A miserable, bruised, and battered heart, spoilt long before he met me. A life, too, hopelessly entangled with a villain's. He did well to cast me off. God be praised, he did it! And yet, had he trusted me, and borne with me a little longer, I would have saved him all this trouble." She was silent for a time, and stood with her eyes fixed on the ground. Again raising them, her look was more mild and calm. "Miles Coverdale," said she. "Well, Zenobia," I responded, "can I do you any service?" "Very little," she replied; "but it is my purpose, as you may well imagine, to remove from Blithedale, and most likely I may not see Hollingsworth again. A woman in my position, you understand, feels scarcely at her ease among former friends. New faces, unaccustomed looks, those only can she tolerate. She would pine among familiar scenes; she would be apt to blush, too, under the eyes that knew her secret. Her heart might throb uncomfortably. She would mortify herself, I suppose, with foolish notions of having sacrificed the honor of her sex at the foot of proud, contumacious man. Poor womanhood, with its rights and wrongs! Here will be new matter for my course of lectures, at the idea of which you smiled, Mr. Coverdale, a month or two ago. But as you have really a heart and sympathies, as far as they go, and as I shall depart without seeing Hollingsworth, I must entreat you to be a messenger between him and me." "Willingly," said I, wondering at the strange way in which her mind seemed to vibrate from the deepest earnest to mere levity. "What is the message?" "True, what is it?" exclaimed Zenobia. "After all, I hardly know. On better consideration, I have no message. Tell him something pretty and pathetic, that will come nicely and sweetly into your ballad. Anything you please, so it be tender and submissive enough. Tell him he has murdered me. Tell him that I'll haunt him." She spoke these words with the wildest energy. "And give him no, give Priscilla this." Thus saying, she took the jewelled flower out of her hair, and it struck me as the act of a queen, when worsted in combat, discrowning herself, as if she found a sort of relief in abasing all her pride. "Bid her wear this for Zenobia's sake," she continued. "She is a pretty little creature, and will make as soft and gentle a wife as the veriest Bluebeard could desire. Pity that she must fade so soon; these delicate and puny maidens always do. 10 years hence let Hollingsworth look at my face and Priscilla's, and then choose betwixt them; or, if he pleases, let him do it now." How magnificently Zenobia looked as she said this! The effect of her beauty was even heightened by the over consciousness and self recognition of it into which, I suppose, Hollingsworth's scorn had driven her. She understood the look of admiration in my face, and, Zenobia to the last, it gave her pleasure. "It is an endless pity," said she, "that I had not bethought myself of winning your heart, Mr. Coverdale, instead of Hollingsworth's. I think I should have succeeded, and many women would have deemed you the worthier conquest of the two. You are certainly much the handsomest man. But there is a fate in these things, and beauty in a man has been of little account with me since my earliest girlhood, when, for once, it turned my head. Now, farewell." "Zenobia, whither are you going?" I asked. "No matter where," said she. "But I am weary of this place, and sick to death of playing at philanthropy and progress. Of all varieties of mock life, we have surely blundered into the very emptiest mockery, in our effort to establish the one true system. I have done with it, and Blithedale must find another woman to superintend the laundry, and you, Mr. Coverdale, another nurse to make your gruel, the next time you fall ill. It was indeed a foolish dream; yet it gave us some pleasant summer days, and bright hopes while they lasted. It can do no more, nor will it avail us to shed tears over a broken bubble. Here is my hand. Adieu." She gave me her hand with the same free, whole souled gesture as on the first afternoon of our acquaintance; and, being greatly moved, I bethought me of no better method of expressing my deep sympathy than to carry it to my lips. In so doing, I perceived that this white hand, so hospitably warm when I first touched it 5 months since, was now cold as a veritable piece of snow. "How very cold!" I exclaimed, holding it between both my own, with the vain idea of warming it. "What can be the reason? It is really deathlike." "The extremities die first, they say," answered Zenobia, laughing. "And so you kiss this poor, despised, rejected hand! Well, my dear friend, I thank you. You have reserved your homage for the fallen. Lip of man will never touch my hand again. I intend to become a Catholic, for the sake of going into a nunnery. When you next hear of Zenobia, her face will be behind the black veil, so look your last at it now, for all is over. Once more, farewell." She withdrew her hand, yet left a lingering pressure, which I felt long afterwards. So intimately connected as I had been with perhaps the only man in whom she was ever truly interested, Zenobia looked on me as the representative of all the past, and was conscious that in bidding me adieu, she likewise took final leave of Hollingsworth and of this whole epoch of her life. Never did her beauty shine out more lustrously than in the last glimpse that I had of her. She departed, and was soon hidden among the trees. But whether it was the strong impression of the foregoing scene, or whatever else the cause, I was affected with a fantasy that Zenobia had not actually gone, but was still hovering about the spot and haunting it. I seemed to feel her eyes upon me. It was as if the vivid coloring of her character had left a brilliant stain upon the air. By degrees, however, the impression grew less distinct. I flung myself upon the fallen leaves at the base of Eliot's pulpit. The sunshine withdrew up the tree trunks, and flickered on the topmost boughs. Gray twilight made the wood obscure. The stars brightened out. The pendant boughs became wet with chill autumnal dews. But I was listless, worn out with emotion on my own behalf and sympathy for others, and had no heart to leave my comfortless lair beneath the rock. I must have fallen asleep and had a dream, all the circumstances of which utterly vanished at the moment when they converged to some tragical catastrophe, and thus grew too powerful for the thin sphere of slumber that enveloped them. Starting from the ground, I found the risen moon shining upon the rugged face of the rock, and myself all in a tremble. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 27. Midnight. It could not have been far from midnight when I came beneath Hollingsworth's window, and finding it open, flung in a tuft of grass with earth at the roots, and heard it fall upon the floor. He was either awake, or sleeping very lightly, for scarcely a moment had gone by before he looked out and discerned me standing in the moonlight. "Is it you, Coverdale?" he asked. "What is the matter?" "Come down to me, Hollingsworth," I answered. "I am anxious to speak with you." The strange tone of my own voice startled me, and him probably no less. He lost no time, and soon issued from the house door, with his dress half arranged. "Again, what is the matter?" he asked impatiently. "Have you seen Zenobia," said I, "since you parted from her at Eliot's pulpit?" "No," answered Hollingsworth, "nor did I expect it." His voice was deep, but had a tremor in it. Hardly had he spoken, when Silas Foster thrust his head, done up in a cotton handkerchief, out of another window, and took what he called, as it literally was, a squint at us. "Well, folks, what are ye about here?" he demanded. "Aha! Are you there, Miles Coverdale? You have been turning night into day since you left us, I reckon; and so you find it quite natural to come prowling about the house at this time o' night, frightening my old woman out of her wits, and making her disturb a tired man out of his best nap. In with you, you vagabond, and to bed." "Dress yourself quickly, Foster," said I. "We want your assistance." I could not, for the life of me, keep that strange tone out of my voice. Silas Foster, obtuse as were his sensibilities, seemed to feel the ghastly earnestness that was conveyed in it, as well as Hollingsworth did. He immediately withdrew his head, and I heard him yawning, muttering to his wife, and again yawning heavily, while he hurried on his clothes. Meanwhile I showed Hollingsworth a delicate handkerchief, marked with a well known cipher, and told him where I found it, and other circumstances which had filled me with a suspicion so terrible that I left him, if he dared, to shape it out for himself. By the time my brief explanation was finished, we were joined by Silas Foster, in his blue woollen frock. "Well, boys," cried he peevishly, "what is to pay now?" "Tell him, Hollingsworth," said I. Hollingsworth shivered perceptibly, and drew in a hard breath betwixt his teeth. He steadied himself, however, and looking the matter more firmly in the face than I had done, explained to Foster my suspicions, and the grounds of them, with a distinctness from which, in spite of my utmost efforts, my words had swerved aside. The tough nerved yeoman, in his comment, put a finish on the business, and brought out the hideous idea in its full terror, as if he were removing the napkin from the face of a corpse. "And so you think she's drowned herself?" he cried. I turned away my face. "What on earth should the young woman do that for?" exclaimed Silas, his eyes half out of his head with mere surprise. "Why, she has more means than she can use or waste, and lacks nothing to make her comfortable but a husband, and that's an article she could have any day. There's some mistake about this, I tell you." "Come," said I, shuddering, "let us go and ascertain the truth." "Well, well," answered Silas Foster, "just as you say. We'll take the long pole with the hook at the end that serves to get the bucket out of the draw well when the rope is broken. With that and a couple of long handled hay rakes, I'll answer for finding her, if she's anywhere to be found. Strange enough! Zenobia drown herself! No, no, I don't believe it. She had too much sense, and too much means, and enjoyed life a great deal too well." When our few preparations were completed, we hastened, by a shorter than the customary route, through fields and pastures, and across a portion of the meadow, to the particular spot on the river bank which I had paused to contemplate in the course of my afternoon's ramble. A nameless presentiment had again drawn me thither, after leaving Eliot's pulpit. I showed my companions where I had found the handkerchief, and pointed to two or three footsteps impressed into the clayey margin, and tending towards the water. Beneath its shallow verge, among the water weeds, there were further traces, as yet unobliterated by the sluggish current, which was there almost at a standstill. Silas Foster thrust his face down close to these footsteps, and picked up a shoe that had escaped my observation, being half imbedded in the mud. "There's a kid shoe that never was made on a Yankee last," observed he. "I know enough of shoemaker's craft to tell that. French manufacture, and see what a high instep, and how evenly she trod in it. There never was a woman that stepped handsomer in her shoes than Zenobia did. Here," he added, addressing Hollingsworth, "would you like to keep the shoe?" Hollingsworth started back. "Give it to me, Foster," said I. I dabbled it in the water to rinse off the mud, and have kept it ever since. Not far from this spot lay an old leaky punt, drawn up on the oozy river side, and generally half full of water. It served the angler to go in quest of pickerel, or the sportsman to pick up his wild ducks. Setting this crazy bark afloat, I seated myself in the stern with the paddle, while Hollingsworth sat in the bows with the hooked pole, and Silas Foster amidships with a hayrake. "It puts me in mind of my young days," remarked Silas, "when I used to steal out of bed to go bobbing for hornpouts and eels. Heigh ho! Well, life and death together make sad work for us all. Then I was a boy, bobbing for fish; and now I'm getting to be an old fellow, and here I be, groping for a dead body. I tell you what, lads, if I thought anything had really happened to Zenobia, I should feel kind o' sorrowful." "I wish, at least, you would hold your tongue," muttered I. The moon that night, though past the full, was still large and oval, and having risen between 8 and 9 o'clock, now shone aslantwise over the river, throwing the high opposite bank, with its woods, into deep shadow, but lighting up the hither shore pretty effectually. Not a ray appeared to fall on the river itself. It lapsed imperceptibly away, a broad, black, inscrutable depth, keeping its own secrets from the eye of man as impenetrably as mid ocean could. "Well, Miles Coverdale," said Foster, "you are the helmsman. How do you mean to manage this business?" "I shall let the boat drift, broadside foremost, past that stump," I replied. "I know the bottom, having sounded it in fishing. The shore on this side, after the first step or two, goes off very abruptly, and there is a pool just by that stump 12 or 15 feet deep. The current could not have force enough to sweep any sunken object, even if partially buoyant, out of that hollow." "Come, then," said Silas. "But I doubt whether I can touch bottom with this hayrake, if it's as deep as you say. Mr. Hollingsworth, I think you'll be the lucky man to night, such luck as it is." We floated past the stump. Silas Foster plied his rake manfully, poking it as far as he could into the water, and immersing the whole length of his arm besides. Hollingsworth at first sat motionless, with the hooked pole elevated in the air; but by and by, with a nervous and jerky movement, he began to plunge it into the blackness that upbore us, setting his teeth, and making precisely such thrusts, methought, as if he were stabbing at a deadly enemy. I bent over the side of the boat. So obscure, however, so awfully mysterious was that dark stream, that, and the thought made me shiver like a leaf, I might as well have tried to look into the enigma of the eternal world, to discover what had become of Zenobia's soul, as into the river depths to find her body. And there perhaps she lay, with her face upward, while the shadow of the boat, and my own pale face peering downward, passed slowly betwixt her and the sky. Once, twice, thrice, I paddled the boat upstream, and again suffered it to glide, with the river's slow, funereal motion, downward. Silas Foster had raked up a large mass of stuff, which, as it came towards the surface, looked somewhat like a flowing garment, but proved to be a monstrous tuft of water weeds. Hollingsworth, with a gigantic effort, upheaved a sunken log. When once free of the bottom, it rose partly out of water, all weedy and slimy, a devilish looking object which the moon had not shone upon for half a hundred years. then plunged again, and sullenly returned to its old resting place for the remnant of the century. "That looked ugly," quoth Silas. "I half thought it was the Evil One, on the same errand as ourselves, searching for Zenobia." "He shall never get her," said I, giving the boat a strong impulse. "That's not for you to say, my boy," retorted the yeoman. "Pray God he never has, and never may. Slow work this, however. I should really be glad to find something. Pshaw! What a notion that is, when the only good luck would be to paddle, and drift, and poke, and grope hereabouts till morning, and have our labor for our pains. For my part, I shouldn't wonder if the creature had only lost her shoe in the mud, and saved her soul alive, after all. My stars, how she will laugh at us to morrow morning!" It is indescribable what an image of Zenobia at the breakfast table, full of warmth and mirthful life, this surmise of Silas Foster's brought before my mind. The terrible phantasm of her death was thrown by it into the remotest and dimmest background, where it seemed to grow as improbable as a myth. "Yes, Silas, it may be as you say," cried I. The drift of the stream had again borne us a little below the stump, when I felt, yes, felt, for it was as if the iron hook had smote my breast, felt Hollingsworth's pole strike some object at the bottom of the river. He started up, and almost overset the boat. "Hold on!" cried Foster. "You have her!" Putting a fury of strength into the effort, Hollingsworth heaved amain, and up came a white swash to the surface of the river. It was the flow of a woman's garments. A little higher, and we saw her dark hair streaming down the current. Black river of death, thou hadst yielded up thy victim. Zenobia was found. Silas Foster laid hold of the body. Hollingsworth likewise grappled with it, and I steered towards the bank, gazing all the while at Zenobia, whose limbs were swaying in the current close at the boat's side. Arriving near the shore, we all three stepped into the water, bore her out, and laid her on the ground beneath a tree. "Poor child!" cried Foster, and his dry old heart, I verily believe, vouchsafed a tear. "I'm sorry for her." Were I to describe the perfect horror of the spectacle, the reader might justly reckon it to me for a sin and shame. For more than 12 long years I have borne it in my memory, and could now reproduce it as freshly as if it were still before my eyes. Of all modes of death, methinks it is the ugliest. Her wet garments swathed limbs of terrible inflexibility. She was the marble image of a death agony. Her arms had grown rigid in the act of struggling, and were bent before her with clenched hands. Her knees, too, were bent, and, thank God for it, in the attitude of prayer. Ah, that rigidity! It is impossible to bear the terror of it. It seemed I must needs impart so much of my own miserable idea it seemed as if her body must keep the same position in the coffin, and that her skeleton would keep it in the grave, and that when Zenobia rose at the day of judgment, it would be in just the same attitude as now. One hope I had, and that, too, was mingled half with fear. She knelt as if in prayer. With the last choking consciousness her soul, bubbling out through her lips, it may be, had given itself up to the Father, reconciled and penitent. But her arms! They were bent before her, as if she struggled against Providence in never ending hostility. Her hands! They were clenched in immitigable defiance. Away with the hideous thought! The flitting moment after Zenobia sank into the dark pool, when her breath was gone and her soul at her lips, was as long, in its capacity of God's infinite forgiveness, as the lifetime of the world. Foster bent over the body, and carefully examined it. "You have wounded the poor thing's breast," said he to Hollingsworth. "Close by her heart, too." "Ha!" cried Hollingsworth with a start. And so he had, indeed, both before and after death. "See," said Foster, "that's the place where the iron struck her. It looks cruelly, but she never felt it. He endeavored to arrange the arms of the corpse decently by its side. His utmost strength, however, scarcely sufficed to bring them down, and rising again the next instant, they bade him defiance, exactly as before. He made another effort, with the same result. "In God's name, Silas Foster," cried I, with bitter indignation, "let that dead woman alone!" "Why, man, it's not decent," answered he, staring at me in amazement. "I can't bear to see her looking so. Well, well," added he, after a third effort, "'tis of no use, sure enough; and we must leave the women to do their best with her after we get to the house. The sooner that's done, the better." We took 2 rails from a neighboring fence, and formed a bier by laying across some boards from the bottom of the boat. And thus we bore Zenobia homeward. 6 hours before, how beautiful! At midnight, what a horror! A reflection occurs to me that will show ludicrously, I doubt not, on my page, but must come in for its sterling truth. Being the woman that she was, could Zenobia have foreseen all these ugly circumstances of death, how ill it would become her, the altogether unseemly aspect which she must put on, and especially old Silas Foster's efforts to improve the matter, she would no more have committed the dreadful act than have exhibited herself to a public assembly in a badly fitting garment. Zenobia, I have often thought, was not quite simple in her death. She had seen pictures, I suppose, of drowned persons in lithe and graceful attitudes; and she deemed it well and decorous to die as so many village maidens have, wronged in their first love, and seeking peace in the bosom of the old familiar stream, so familiar that they could not dread it, where in childhood they used to bathe their little feet, wading mid-leg deep, unmindful of wet skirts. But in Zenobia's case there was some tint of the Arcadian affectation that had been visible enough in all our lives for a few months past. This, however, to my conception, takes nothing from the tragedy; for has not the world come to an awfully sophisticated pass, when, after a certain degree of acquaintance with it, we cannot even put ourselves to death in whole-hearted simplicity? Slowly, slowly, with many a dreary pause, resting the bier often on some rock, or balancing it across a mossy log to take fresh hold, we bore our burden onward through the moonlight, and at last laid Zenobia on the floor of the old farmhouse. By and by came 3 or 4 withered women, and stood whispering around the corpse, peering at it through their spectacles, holding up their skinny hands, shaking their night-capped heads, and taking counsel of one another's experience what was to be done. With those tirewomen we left Zenobia. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 28. Blithedale Pasture. Blithedale, thus far in its progress, had never found the necessity of a burial ground. There was some consultation among us in what spot Zenobia might most fitly be laid. It was my own wish that she should sleep at the base of Eliot's pulpit, and that on the rugged front of the rock, the name by which we familiarly knew her, Zenobia, and not another word, should be deeply cut, and left for the moss and lichens to fill up at their long leisure. But Hollingsworth, to whose ideas on this point great deference was due, made it his request that her grave might be dug on the gently sloping hillside in the wide pasture, where, as we once supposed, Zenobia and he had planned to build their cottage. And thus it was done accordingly. She was buried very much as other people have been for hundreds of years gone by. In anticipation of death, we Blithedale colonists had sometimes set our fancies at work to arrange a funereal ceremony, which should be the proper symbolic expression of our spiritual faith and eternal hopes; and this we meant to substitute for those customary rites which were moulded originally out of the Gothic gloom, and by long use, like an old velvet pall, have so much more than their first death smell in them. But when the occasion came, we found it the simplest and truest thing, after all, to content ourselves with the old fashion, taking away what we could, but interpolating no novelties, and particularly avoiding all frippery of flowers and cheerful emblems. The procession moved from the farmhouse. Nearest the dead walked an old man in deep mourning, his face mostly concealed in a white handkerchief, and with Priscilla leaning on his arm. Hollingsworth and myself came next. We all stood around the narrow niche in the cold earth, all saw the coffin lowered in, all heard the rattle of the crumbly soil upon its lid, that final sound which mortality awakens on the utmost verge of sense, as if in the vain hope of bringing an echo from the spiritual world. I noticed a stranger to most of those present, though known to me, who, after the coffin had descended, took up a handful of earth and flung it first into the grave. I had given up Hollingsworth's arm, and now found myself near this man. "It was an idle thing, a foolish thing for Zenobia to do," said he. "She was the last woman in the world to whom death could have been necessary. It was too absurd. I have no patience with her." "Why so?" I inquired, smothering my horror at his cold comment, in my eager curiosity to discover some tangible truth as to his relation with Zenobia. If any crisis could justify the sad wrong she offered to herself, it was surely that in which she stood. Everything had failed her; prosperity in the world's sense, for her opulence was gone, the heart's prosperity in love; and there was a secret burden on her, the nature of which is best known to you. Young as she was, she had tried life fully, had no more to hope, and something, perhaps, to fear. Had Providence taken her away in its own holy hand, I should have thought it the kindest dispensation that could be awarded to one so wrecked." "You mistake the matter completely," rejoined Westervelt. "What, then, is your own view of it?" I asked. "Her mind was active, and various in its powers," said he. "Her heart had a manifold adaptation, her constitution an infinite buoyancy, which, had she possessed only a little patience to await the reflux of her troubles, would have borne her upward triumphantly for 20 years to come. Her beauty would not have waned, or scarcely so, and surely not beyond the reach of art to restore it, in all that time. She had life's summer all before her, and 100 varieties of brilliant success. What an actress Zenobia might have been! It was one of her least valuable capabilities. How forcibly she might have wrought upon the world, either directly in her own person, or by her influence upon some man, or a series of men, of controlling genius! Every prize that could be worth a woman's having, and many prizes which other women are too timid to desire, lay within Zenobia's reach. In all this, I observed, there would have been nothing to satisfy her heart. "Her heart," answered Westervelt contemptuously. "That troublesome organ, as she had hitherto found it, would have been kept in its due place and degree, and have had all the gratification it could fairly claim. She would soon have established a control over it. Love had failed her, you say? Had it never failed her before? Yet she survived it, and loved again; possibly not once alone, nor twice either. And now to drown herself for yonder dreamy philanthropist!" "Who are you," I exclaimed indignantly, "that dare to speak thus of the dead? You seem to intend a eulogy, yet leave out whatever was noblest in her, and blacken while you mean to praise. I have long considered you as Zenobia's evil fate. Your sentiments confirm me in the idea, but leave me still ignorant as to the mode in which you have influenced her life. The connection may have been indissoluble, except by death. Then, indeed, always in the hope of God's infinite mercy, I cannot deem it a misfortune that she sleeps in yonder grave." "No matter what I was to her," he answered gloomily, yet without actual emotion. "She is now beyond my reach. Had she lived, and hearkened to my counsels, we might have served each other well. But there Zenobia lies in yonder pit, with the dull earth over her. 20 years of a brilliant lifetime thrown away for a mere woman's whim. Heaven deal with Westervelt according to his nature and deserts, that is to say, annihilate him. He was altogether earthy, worldly, made for time and its gross objects, and incapable, except by a sort of dim reflection caught from other minds, of so much as one spiritual idea. Whatever stain Zenobia had was caught from him, nor does it seldom happen that a character of admirable qualities loses its better life because the atmosphere that should sustain it is rendered poisonous by such breath as this man mingled with Zenobia's. Yet his reflections possessed their share of truth. It was a woeful thought that a woman of Zenobia's diversified capacity should have fancied herself irretrievably defeated on the broad battlefield of life, and with no refuge save to fall on her own sword, merely because love had gone against her. It is nonsense, and a miserable wrong, the result, like so many others, of masculine egotism, that the success or failure of woman's existence should be made to depend wholly on the affections, and on one species of affection, while man has such a multitude of other chances that this seems but an incident. For its own sake, if it will do no more, the world should throw open all its avenues to the passport of a woman's bleeding heart. As we stood around the grave, I looked often towards Priscilla, dreading to see her wholly overcome with grief. And deeply grieved, in truth, she was. But a character so simply constituted as hers has room only for a single predominant affection. No other feeling can touch the heart's inmost core, nor do it any deadly mischief. Thus, while we see that such a being responds to every breeze with tremulous vibration, and imagine that she must be shattered by the first rude blast, we find her retaining her equilibrium amid shocks that might have overthrown many a sturdier frame. So with Priscilla. Her one possible misfortune was Hollingsworth's unkindness, and that was destined never to befall her. Never yet, at least, for Priscilla has not died. But Hollingsworth! After all the evil that he did, are we to leave him thus, blessed with the entire devotion of this one true heart, and with wealth at his disposal to execute the long contemplated project that had led him so far astray? What retribution is there here? My mind being vexed with precisely this query, I made a journey, some years since, for the sole purpose of catching a last glimpse of Hollingsworth, and judging for myself whether he were a happy man or no. I learned that he inhabited a small cottage, that his way of life was exceedingly retired, and that my only chance of encountering him or Priscilla was to meet them in a secluded lane, where, in the latter part of the afternoon, they were accustomed to walk. I did meet them accordingly. As they approached me, I observed in Hollingsworth's face a depressed and melancholy look that seemed habitual. The powerfully built man showed a self distrustful weakness, and a childlike or childish tendency to press close, and closer still, to the side of the slender woman whose arm was within his. In Priscilla's manner there was a protective and watchful quality, as if she felt herself the guardian of her companion; but likewise a deep, submissive, unquestioning reverence, and also a veiled happiness in her fair and quiet countenance. Drawing nearer, Priscilla recognized me, and gave me a kind and friendly smile, but with a slight gesture which I could not help interpreting as an entreaty not to make myself known to Hollingsworth. Nevertheless, an impulse took possession of me, and compelled me to address him. "I have come, Hollingsworth," said I, "to view your grand edifice for the reformation of criminals. Is it finished yet?" "No, nor begun," answered he, without raising his eyes. "A very small one answers all my purposes." Priscilla threw me an upbraiding glance; but I spoke again, with a bitter and revengeful emotion, as if flinging a poisoned arrow at Hollingsworth's heart. "Up to this moment," I inquired, "how many criminals have you reformed?" "Not one," said Hollingsworth, with his eyes still fixed on the ground. "Ever since we parted, I have been busy with a single murderer." Then the tears gushed into my eyes, and I forgave him; for I remembered the wild energy, the passionate shriek with which Zenobia had spoken those words, "Tell him he has murdered me! Tell him that I'll haunt him!" And I knew what murderer he meant, and whose vindictive shadow dogged the side where Priscilla was not. The moral which presents itself to my reflections, as drawn from Hollingsworth's character and errors, is simply this: that, admitting what is called philanthropy, when adopted as a profession, to be often useful, by its energetic impulse, to society at large, it is perilous to the individual whose ruling passion, in one exclusive channel, it thus becomes. It ruins, or is fearfully apt to ruin, the heart, the rich juices of which God never meant should be pressed violently out and distilled into alcoholic liquor by an unnatural process, but should render life sweet, bland, and gently beneficent, and insensibly influence other hearts and other lives to the same blessed end. I see in Hollingsworth an exemplification of the most awful truth in Bunyan's book of such, "From the very gate of heaven there is a byway to the pit." But all this while we have been standing by Zenobia's grave. I have never since beheld it, but make no question that the grass grew all the better on that little parallelogram of pasture land for the decay of the beautiful woman who slept beneath. How Nature seems to love us! And how readily, nevertheless, without a sigh or a complaint, she converts us to a meaner purpose, when her highest one, that of a conscious intellectual life and sensibility, has been untimely balked. While Zenobia lived, Nature was proud of her, and directed all eyes upon that radiant presence as her fairest handiwork. Zenobia perished. Will not Nature shed a tear? Ah, no! She adopts the calamity at once into her system, and is just as well pleased, for aught we can see, with the tuft of ranker vegetation that grew out of Zenobia's heart, as with all the beauty which has bequeathed us no earthly representative, except in this crop of weeds. It is because the spirit is inestimable that the lifeless body is so little valued. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Blithedale Romance. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Chapter 29. Miles Coverdale's Confession. It remains only to say a few words about myself. Not improbably the reader might be willing to spare me the trouble, for I have made but a poor and dim figure in my own narrative, establishing no separate interest, and suffering my colorless life to take its hue from other lives. But one still retains some little consideration for oneself, so I keep these last 2 or 3 pages for my individual and sole behoof. But what, after all, have I to tell? Nothing, nothing, nothing. I left Blithedale within the week after Zenobia's death, and went back thither no more. The whole soil of our farm, for a long time afterwards, seemed but the sodded earth over her grave. I could not toil there, nor live upon its products. Often, however, in these years that are darkening around me, I remember our beautiful scheme of a noble and unselfish life, and how fair in that first summer appeared the prospect that it might endure for generations, and be perfected, as the ages rolled away, into the system of a people and a world! Were my former associates now there, were there only 3 or 4 of those true hearted men still laboring in the sun, I sometimes fancy that I should direct my world weary footsteps thitherward, and entreat them to receive me, for old friendship's sake. More and more I feel that we had struck upon what ought to be a truth. Posterity may dig it up, and profit by it. The experiment, so far as its original projectors were concerned, proved long ago a failure, first lapsing into Fourierism, and dying, as it well deserved, for this infidelity to its own higher spirit. Where once we toiled with our whole hopeful hearts, the town paupers, aged, nerveless, and disconsolate, creep sluggishly afield. Alas, what faith is requisite to bear up against such results of generous effort! My subsequent life has passed, I was going to say happily, but at all events tolerably enough. I am now at middle age, well, well, a step or two beyond the midmost point, and I care not a fig who knows it. A bachelor, with no very decided purpose of ever being otherwise. I have been twice to Europe, and spent a year or 2 rather agreeably at each visit. Being well to do in the world, and having nobody but myself to care for, I live very much at my ease, and fare sumptuously every day. As for poetry, I have given it up, notwithstanding that Dr. Griswold, as the reader of course knows, has placed me at a fair elevation among our minor minstrelsy, on the strength of my pretty little volume published 10 years ago. As regards human progress, in spite of my irrepressible yearnings over the Blithedale reminiscences, let them believe in it who can, and aid in it who choose. If I could earnestly do either, it might be all the better for my comfort. As Hollingsworth once told me, I lack a purpose. How strange! He was ruined morally by an overplus of the very same ingredient, the want of which, I occasionally suspect, has rendered my own life all an emptiness. I by no means wish to die; yet were there any cause in this whole chaos of human struggle worth a sane man's dying for, and which my death would benefit, then, provided, however, the effort did not involve an unreasonable amount of trouble, methinks I might be bold to offer up my life. If Kossuth, for example, would pitch the battlefield of Hungarian rights within an easy ride of my abode, and choose a mild, sunny morning after breakfast for the conflict, Miles Coverdale would gladly be his man for one brave rush upon the levelled bayonets. Further than that, I should be loath to pledge myself. I exaggerate my own defects. The reader must not take my own word for it, nor believe me altogether changed from the young man who once hoped strenuously, and struggled not so much amiss. Frostier heads than mine have gained honor in the world; frostier hearts have imbibed new warmth, and been newly happy. Life, however, it must be owned, has come to a rather idle pass with me. Would my friends like to know what brought it thither? There is one secret I have concealed it all along, and never meant to let the least whisper of it escape one foolish little secret, which possibly may have had something to do with these inactive years of meridian manhood, with my bachelorship, with the unsatisfied retrospect that I fling back on life, and my listless glance towards the future. Shall I reveal it? It is an absurd thing for a man in his afternoon, a man of the world, moreover, with these 3 white hairs in his brown mustache, and that deepening track of a crow's foot on each temple, an absurd thing ever to have happened, and quite the absurdest for an old bachelor like me to talk about. But it rises to my throat, so let it come. I perceive, moreover, that the confession, brief as it shall be, will throw a gleam of light over my behavior throughout the foregoing incidents, and is indeed essential to the full understanding of my story. The reader, therefore, since I have disclosed so much, is entitled to this one word more. As I write it, he will charitably suppose me to blush, and turn away my face. I myself, was in love with Priscilla. End of Chapter 29. End of The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne.